This will sound very strange, but it is predicted that singer-songwriter Paul Simon will die on February 22nd, 2024. The date that this video is posted proves that this prediction is being made ahead of time, as does this time-stamped email and forensic notes PDF document. If you are skeptical for some reason, please email me and I will forward these to you. As of the date that this video is posted, December 25th, 2023, there is zero news online regarding Paul Simon's health. In this profound and important video, I will explain how it is through God's prophetic signs that it is known that Paul Simon will die on February 22nd, 2024. Among other things, this video will discuss the importance of the song Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water and its symbolic connection to the rescue of God's faithful before the period of God's wrath and end times judgment on the world. This video will also explain the importance of Simon and Garfunkel's historic reunion concert in Central Park in Manhattan in 1981, and also the release of Simon's new album titled Seven Psalms, for which Simon says he received guidance through prophetic dreams. This video will also explain how the composer and singer of the song 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover and Mrs. Robinson is a prophetic sign that is pointing to the date on which Michelle Robinson Obama will become the 50th U.S. Vice President. This video will also explain how God has used Jeffrey Epstein in connection with Paul Simon-related prophetic signs in order to communicate some very important truths. All right, it is a great pleasure and privilege to explain this video, this diagram, and this prediction that singer-songwriter Paul Simon will die on January 3rd, 2024. All right, this video was originally produced prior to January 3rd, 2024, and we received on this date, it is now after January 3rd, today is January 7th, and on January 3rd, we received very profound prophetic signs, and they are related to Paul Simon. In other words, all of the analysis that you see in this diagram that is explained in this video is 100% correct. It just is that this date, January 3rd, ended up being a step in the trail of signs leading to the date it is predicted that Paul Simon will die 50 days later on February 22nd. And when this happens on February 22nd, it will prove everything that I am saying, including what I just said, which is that all of this analysis that you see in this diagram that will be explained in this video is correct. And this video is truly profound. All of what I'm about to explain is amazing, and you will really appreciate this video. I'm going to leave the video as it is. Keep in mind, like I just said, that it was originally produced prior to January 3rd, and that January 3rd is relevant and the analysis is correct. Okay, so essentially in this diagram here, we have the prediction for Paul Simon's death on January 3rd, and then 50 days later we have this date, which was known ahead of time before January 3rd, obviously, to be an important date in God's signs. Now, Paul Simon is related to these events, but this isn't So the big picture of signs becomes clearer and clearer as more pieces of the puzzle, more signs, more development happens. It's a big picture. And it's become clearer why God was pointing to February 22nd. It's the day that Paul Simon will die, and not the day of the coming solar storm that will knock out the power grid, which is now believed to be April 1st. The eruption of Yellowstone is believed to be May 26th. So, anyway, essentially, the prediction for Paul Simon's death is simply moved 50 days down this trail of signs right here in this diagram. All right, so keep that in mind as I'm explaining things, because the video was made before January 3rd, and it's still all relevant, and so that's why I'm reposting it, because it's what you need to know. It's just that it's 50 days later in this trail. That's simple, right? And I'll explain the relevance of 50 days as I explain this video.
All right. Now, to begin this story, I should explain how this story came about, how it is. The question you might have, of course, is how in the world do I know this, or how did I even come to think of this? And that story begins with my understanding that God is using the Graceland estate in Memphis, Tennessee, Elvis's Graceland estate, as major prophetic symbolism in his signs. Now, to explain that would require an entire other video. But I'll say, for example, it is symbolism for the Temple Mount, and the death of Martin Luther King Jr. near Graceland is symbolism for how Jesus was crucified just outside the Temple Mount complex. And the pilgrimages that people make to Memphis, or rather Graceland, are an allusion to the pilgrimages that people do and will make in the Messianic age, when Jesus will begin his 1,000 years of peace rule from the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And that got me thinking about Paul Simon's famous album Graceland, and also the song Graceland, and how the song is about the pilgrimage. He makes a pilgrimage with his 9-year-old son, and he's driving down the highway. And that's another thing, is that God has been using the I-55 highway in his signs related to what I am saying or talking about. And that's the case in the lyrics of the song. He's driving down the highway with his son on his way to Graceland. And so I initially was attempting to find the connections from the release of the album Graceland. But long story short, I do believe that the album and song Graceland do connect into God's true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections. However, it won't be discussed in this video. Now, it has been known that Paul Simon, the famous singer-songwriter of Simon and Garfunkel, will die on January 3rd, and this has been known since January of 2023, and possibly December of 2022. I can't recall exactly. And that initial discovery was due to this connection, or rather, this discovery of January 3rd initially came through this discovery. It was at some point, like I'm saying, in January, I think, of 2023, if not December of 2022, it was realized that the most famous song of Paul Simon's, Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water, is in fact a prophetic sign and is symbolism, an allusion to the rapture. Now, if you don't know what the rapture is, it is Christianity's most preposterous idea, and that is that God's faithful will be rescued from the severe persecution from the Antichrist. They will not die, they will disappear and be with the Lord in the kingdom of heaven, and then return with the Lord on the Day of Atonement in his second coming in October of 2024. And like a bridge over troubled water is the perfect analogy for this, because God's faithful will require this bridge over this period of time of severe tribulation, as it is called in the Bible, during the period of the Antichrist, this last 5 months of time before the second coming. And so this like a bridge is like the rapture, a bridge over troubled water. Now, this date here, January 24th, 2020, is the date of the release of this documentary video on the 50th anniversary of the release of this song, Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water, which was released on January 20th, 1970. 50 years is extremely prophetic in the Bible, and it is relevant in context of what we are talking about, which is the rapture. The 50-year, the Jubilee cycle, the Jubilee in Leviticus chapter 25 regards God's people returning to their original inheritance, their return home, their return to their original land and clan, which is symbolism for, in this case, God's faithful returning home. God's faithful are not at home in this world. Their home is in the kingdom. And that is the significance, the extreme relevance of this 50-year anniversary of Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water. And this documentary is significant. It talks about the making of this song, and it's very interesting. I recommend it, and I will leave a link to this and a few other things in the description box below this video. And part of the making of this song is how Paul Simon originally didn't have a third verse for the song, but it was encouraged by Art Garfunkel and I believe some other people involved in the production, that the song needed a dramatic ending. And the way Art Garfunkel describes it in this documentary is that he believed that it was a song waiting to take off and fly. And that's a perfect analogy. But it is also prophetic, because those that will be raptured will fly. They will meet the Lord in the air, as it is said in Bible prophecy. And so flight, flying, taking off is symbolism for the rapture. And that is the nature of this song. What makes it so timeless and classic and regarded highly, a big part of its success is the structure of the song and how the song is, like I'm saying, a build-up until this takeoff down the runway, as Art Garfunkel was explaining. So the dramatic ending of this song is a big part of this song, in other words, and again, that is because it is symbolism for this taking off of the Lord's faithful over the bridge, over the troubled water. All right, now, once this was realized, I guess intuitively, that this would be a prophetic sign, because it's a lot more difficult for the Lord to connect something back in 1970. But if you were wishing to connect it to, for example, the day that Paul Simon will die, it would be easier to do to make a connection from the 50th anniversary, which is, like I just explained, appropriate in any case. And so this documentary video was released on this day. And so I did a little number crunching, and I came up with this connection here, which is 1,440 days. That's very significant, because there are 1,440 minutes in a day. And this number has been used in God's signs and connections before. It is, we inherit 1,440 minutes in a day from ancient Babylon. And in the Bible, Babylon is Antichrist system and Antichrist symbolism. But also, and another thing too about the number 1,440 is that the 1,440th word in Strong's Greek New Testament Concordance is the word 70. And that's very prophetic in God's signs as well, regarding the timing of the second coming of Lord Jesus Christ, as it is an allusion to the most central prophecy in the Bible in Daniel chapter 9, for example. But also, 1,440 hints at the number 144. And that number, 144, is an extremely prophetic number in the book of Revelation, that is symbolism for those that will be raptured. Not all people that are into Bible prophecy are aware of this fact, and it is a fact. This number in the book of Revelation, the 144,000, is a reference to those that will be raptured. It is symbolic of God's faithful who will be raptured. And that is why this connection is relevant from this song, Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water, which is symbolism for the rapture. We have this connection and a number that is symbolic of the rapture. And that gets us to the day that Paul Simon is predicted to die, January 3rd, 2024. And at the time, it was then easily calculated. When I say at the time, I mean January of 2023, when all of this initial discovery was made. It was easily calculated that this date is 50 days prior to this date, February 22nd, 2024. And at that time, it was believed that this date would be the date of the rapture. It was shortly after that it was realized that it isn't, and rather it is a step in a trail of signs leading to the rapture, because God has connected many rapture connections to this date. And that is why I say that. However, it is also the day of the predicted solar storm, and that will hit Earth and knock out America's power grid, which will precede and I believe will trigger the eruption of Yellowstone volcano 2 days later. All right, so the date, February 22nd, hints it is a series of twos, and it is symbolic of a number of things, but one thing that it is symbolic of and why it is a step in the trail of signs to the rapture is that it hints at the second coming of Lord Jesus Christ. 50 days symbolizes the church. The church age began on Pentecost, and Pentecost literally means 50th day. And so in God's signs, because it was 50 days from, symbolic, I should say, not a literal 50 days. But anyway, it was 50 days symbolically in the Omer count that is described in Leviticus from Passover, the day that Jesus was crucified. Okay, so shortly after that, this discovery of this, so in other words, this 50 days confirmed that this was relevant, this 1,440 days. So now it was clear, in my opinion at the time, even though it was just these two connections, that likely something is going on with January 3rd and Paul Simon, okay? But shortly after this discovery, it was learned that the resurrection rapture event will be on Pentecost. In the calendar that watches for new moons, which will be in 2024, May 26th. The evidence for this is as high as Mount Everest. I don't even call this a prediction. This is like a fact. The rapture will be on this date. But it just so happens that this date is exactly 144 days after January 3rd, which is in turn 1,440 days after this prophetic Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water documentary. And that is stunning. It is stunning confirmation. We have a 1,440 days connection followed by a 144 days connection between Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water, which is symbolic of the rapture, on the 50th anniversary, no less, to the rapture. We have a 1,440 days plus 144 days. Both of these numbers hint at the rapture, the 144,000 in Revelation, and that gets us to the rapture event. When Paul Simon will die on this date, it will hint at Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water and will be pointing to the rapture. Okay, so another side note here, and I don't really mean a side note, but this 1,440 days and 144 days provide a hint confirmation for this 14 days, right? You can see that, right? These two numbers here hint at the number 14 because January 3rd plus 14 gets us to this prediction, which is the date that it is predicted that famous actor James Earl Jones will die, on January 17th. That is a subject for not just one other video, but many other videos. But he is king symbolism, the Lion King voice. And okay, so let's just stop that, not go any further into the James Earl Jones rabbit trail, okay? I just wanted to add that because of the 14s here. Now, it is relevant, though, because the coming solar storm eruption on the sun, God is communicated through signs to be a symbolic lion's roar. The voice of the Lion King is connected to this as well, the coming solar storm. The voice of the Lion King is symbolic of the lion's roar, which is why his death will be important. He will also, by the way, die on his 93rd birthday, and the sun is 93 million miles away from Earth. All right, now, this 50 days here is also relevant regarding Paul Simon, because his only number one hit as a solo artist was the song 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover. All right, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover hints at 50 days for God to judge his lover, America. America is God's Gentile nation, whom he has had his hand on throughout its history. There are only two nations in the history of the world that were founded on a relationship with God and on the Bible, Israel and America. So anyway, 50 Ways hints at 50 days. From Paul Simon's death, who had one number one hit as a solo artist, 50 Ways, it is 50 days to the coming solar storm. Now, why is Paul Simon related to the coming solar storm? Would be a good question. Well, that is part of this theme regarding like a bridge over troubled water. It occurred to me in January or so of 2023 that God is using the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam that was built in the 1930s over the Colorado River is symbolic of like a bridge over troubled water. It's amazing. Now, how I connected Paul Simon to that, I can't recall. It was more likely than anything the Holy Spirit. Anyway. So, actually, that's not in this diagram. That's in the next diagram. There will be another diagram, by the way. All right. I actually jumped ahead. All right. To finish this diagram, at the time that it was learned that Paul Simon would die on January 3rd, which was again January of 2023, or December of 2022, it was not known that Paul Simon, I don't think anyone knew, that Paul Simon was working on a new album. I did not know, in fact, of this until I went back into this Paul Simon, my notes and diagrams regarding Paul Simon, and that was just a couple of days ago. I learned that in the meantime, since I had first learned of the Lord using Paul Simon and his death, predicted death, that in the meantime, Paul Simon had released a new album. And that knowledge was accidental because it was just, YouTube recommended something, an interview, and I clicked it, and then they were talking about his new album, and I didn't expect it at all. So thank the Lord that this happened, that I clicked on that video, because this is so huge. This is so significant. As Paul Simon, I've watched many interviews of him. He made the rounds doing these interviews, and there's a big story behind his new album and how it came to be. And the big thing about this story, including, by the way, He made a trailer documentary, if you will, a short video explaining this and how this new album came to be. But the biggest part of this story, in fact, the story, is how he had a dream, and whenever he talks about it, he gives the specific date. Every time he talks about the dream, he mentions the date of the dream. But he had this profound dream in which he says that in the dream, this powerful, realistic dream, he describes it as, he says that he was told that you are working on a new album, you are working on 7 Psalms. He says that either the dream told him this is what you're working on now, or this is what you will be working on. He was told that he was working on 7 Psalms, as in Psalms of the Bible, as in the Psalms that David wrote in the book of Psalms in the Bible. And he woke up and wrote it down on a piece of paper, which is now framed and is shown in the video, for example. So it's a big part of the story. When he has had interviewers visit his studio, he shows them the framed piece of paper that he wrote down what, 7 Psalms on, right after he had this dream. So the dream told him he was making this new album, 7 Psalms, okay? And that was January 15th, 2019. Like I said, he mentions it every time he talks about it. He mentions specifically the date. All right? Now, the album 7 Psalms was released on May 19th, 2023. Which was 4 years, 4 months, and 4 days after his dream. The number 4 is symbolic in the Bible of man and the material world, as E.W. Bullinger would say. It is the number of the city number as well, which is why it is symbolism for Damascus in God's signs. The oldest continuously inhabited city in the world is Damascus, Syria. And in Bible prophecy, it is said that this city will be completely destroyed and never lived in again. And that hasn't happened. And that is how we know that this prophecy was never fulfilled in history and is still yet to be fulfilled. Well, anyway, it is another subject. It's related. But on May 19th, 2023, there was also another prophetic sign, which was Vladimir Zelensky, a man that God is using in his signs as symbolism for many things, but also specifically the Antichrist, the 44th president, the first Jewish leader of Ukraine. Right before the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, Zelensky had turned 44 years old, and the nation of Ukraine was made up of 44 million people before the exodus, the evacuation from Ukraine. And again, the rapture will be an evacuation, an exodus, escape from the Antichrist, the 44th president. And so anyway, on May 19th, 2023, we had an important prophetic sign involving the 44-year-old of 44 million, Zelensky, when he attended the Arab League summit. And this was on his way to the G7 summit in Hiroshima, Japan, the following day. Now, this summit is significant prophetically because the Arab League, welcomed back Syria into the Arab League after many years. And again, Damascus, Syria is predicted to be destroyed by Israel overnight, as a Bible prophecy says. And again, the number of Damascus is symbolized by 444. Or 44, for that matter, or 4. I forgot to mention that in the Bible, Damascus is symbolic of the world, which is the reason for it being symbolized by the number 4 and 44 and 444. Also, the 444th word in Strong's Greek New Testament Concordance is the word man, which is another reason why the Antichrist is the 44th president. All right, so 7 Psalms was released on this day, and this message that Paul Simon received in his dream to make 7 Psalms, I believe is partly for the purpose of pointing to the book of Revelation, which has a series of 7s in it. And specifically, there are 3 sets of 7 judgments. There is the 7 seals and 7 trumpets. And by the way, the 7th trumpet is the rapture with the 144,000 described in Revelation chapter 7. And also the 7 bowls or vials of judgment. So, in other words, 7 Psalms is a hint at the coming end times in the Antichrist and the judgments coming on the world that are described in these 3 sets of 7 judgments in the book of Revelation. And that's why the timing of the death of Paul Simon and his album, 7 Psalms. Now, I've listened to the album twice now, and I recommend it, not only because it is a prophetic sign from God, and God told him to make this album, but I actually think it's interesting what Paul Simon has produced musically. And a lot of people also agree. I'm not talking about other people that are into Bible prophecy. I'm just talking in general. The reception among people and the critics has been positive regarding this album. And Paul Simon says that he is he said he would rather not use the cliche, but he uses it anyway because it's the word that describes it. But he says that often he is like a conduit for when he is producing music. But there have been a few instances that have stood out more than others when he is being a conduit for music production. He says that it's not really him, it's just flowing through him. And one of those times was like a bridge over troubled water. And let's see, the other time, Graceland. Coincidentally, these are the 2 prophetic songs that I felt intuitively that God would be using, and he says that these are, and he says these in these new interviews. I didn't know this before, but he says that the production of the album 7 Psalms is like this. The guitar riffs just came to him. And then he says that the words came to him after this too. he said there was a period where 2 or 3 times a week he would wake up at 3 or so in the morning with words on his mind, and he would just write them down. And so he says that he basically was an editor. He just, all of this, the music and the words came, and he just later edited it and put it all together, which is interesting. Now, the album, it's 33 minutes, and there's no separation between the tracks digitally on the CD, for example, from what I understand. But there are 7 segments, if you will, hence the 7 Psalms, right? And the album, some interviewers asked Paul Simon about it being about mortality, and Paul Simon rejected that. He would reject this and say, well, that's an aspect of it, especially the last track of the 7, but it's about more than that. It's about the existence of God and the bigger picture and stuff, as he would say. So, now the album ends with him and his wife singing together. The very last note, the very last word is Amen. But I'm just going to refresh my memory and give you the exact lyric of his wife, Edie Brickell, right before they sing together Amen, and then the album ends. Okay, Edie Brickell sings, this is the second last lyric of the album before they sing together Amen. She sings, "Heaven is beautiful, it's almost like home. Children, get ready, it's time to come home." This is there are no words, I'm speechless, actually. Given what we are talking about here, and this album being from the Lord, and the death of Paul, and the release of this album shortly before the predicted death of Paul Simon, which is shortly before the end times and the period of tribulation and the Antichrist, and the 2/3 of America, or I believe that the signs are indicating that 2/3 of America, or Americans, will die in the next year. 1/3 of the world's population. But anyway, this album ends with, "Children, get ready. It's time to come home." Heaven is beautiful. It's almost like home. Children, get ready. It's time to come home. All right, now, as I will show here, this trail of signs begins with the release, in this lower part of the diagram, begins with the release of Paul Simon's very famous Homeward Bound song. Okay. Now, so this is 7 Psalms we're talking about, which is, again, like I am saying, a hint at the 3 sets of 7, the 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls of judgments that are about death in the book of Revelation. And this album is about mortality. It isn't only, as Paul Simon would say, but it is. And the last lyric is, "Children, get ready. It's time to come home." In other words, a lot of people are about to die. It's time to get ready. Okay, now this album was released 229 days prior to the date it is predicted that Paul Simon will die. 229 is the 50th prime number. And this connection is then followed by a connection of 50 days, which is hinted at again with 50 ways to leave your lover. What is confirmation of this is that the song Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water won 5 awards at the 13th Grammy Awards. The 13th Grammy Awards is a hint at this date, 1-3, January 3rd, which hints at 13. 1-3 hints at 13. In God's signs, this isn't the only instance of the date 1-3 hinting at 13. And anyway, that is the connection to the 13th Grammys. But again, it connects, as I explained earlier, with 1,440 days to the anniversary documentary of Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water, which won 5 awards at the 13th Grammy Awards. It also won Album of the Year, and it was Simon and Garfunkel's 5th and final album together. That's another 5. So it won 5 awards. The song won 5 awards. It was from their 5th album. It is 50 days from Simon's death to this predicted solar storm, and 50th prime number after the release of his new album. The release of his new album, the prophetic album that the Lord told him to make in a dream, was released exactly 500 months, which is a hint at 50. After the very famous Simon and Garfunkel reunion with their Central Park, New York City concert, in which 500,000 people came to watch this free concert. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel had been broken up for many years prior to this, and they got together again for a few years, but it began with this concert in Central Park, their reunion. And reunion is also symbolic of the reunion of God's people, as in, children, get ready, it's time to come home. A reunion with God's faithful and God. Also, Paul Simon in Hebrew gematria, and Paul Simon is Jewish, by the way, is 500. If you don't know what gematria is, Roman, Greek, and Hebrew letters are also numbers, and as such, names and words can be converted into a numeric value. And the numeric value of the name Paul Simon is 500. Paul Simon reunioned. Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel had their prophetic reunion in Central Park in New York City, in Manhattan, in which 500,000 people attended, exactly 500 months before the release of this 7 Psalms album. which is followed by the 50th prime number, which is followed by 50 days, which is hinted at with 50 ways. And again, this connects to Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water that won 5 awards and was on their 5th album. Hence the 500 months connection. Also, the 500th word in Strong's Greek New Testament Concordance is the word Antichrist. The reason for Central Park in New York City is because this date here, January 3rd, 1-3, is a reflection of 3-1. In fact, outside of the US, the date 1-3 is written as 3-1, which hints at 31. And 31 days after this date is the date it is predicted that the bomb or dirty bomb or suitcase nuke will explode in Manhattan, and there will be a mass evacuation, which will be symbolic of the rapture, predicted to be on February 3rd, 2024, 31 days after the date 1-3, which is a reflection of 3-1. And that's why the tie-in of this sign here in New York City, in Manhattan, in Central Park. What is stunning confirmation of this also is that the number 188 is extremely important in God's big picture of signs, patterns, and connections. His true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections, which is only being explained on this channel. The number 188 because the 188th word in Strong's Hebrew Old Testament Concordance is the word woe, ! Used in context of extreme judgment from God. And so it is exactly 188 months from the release of the song Homeward Bound to the reunion in Central Park, which connects to the 7 Psalms album, which connects to the death of Paul Simon, which connects to the rapture and the reunion of man and God. I think you're appreciating by now how important this diagram is and how important all of this is and how important Paul Simon is, not only in music history, but of course this is the reason why Paul Simon has been so important in music history of the 20th century. It is for the purpose of what we are talking about in this diagram, ultimately. There's one last thing here. Oh, I did include this 31 days mentioned here. Okay. One last thing too here in this diagram. Paul Simon was born in 1941, and the date of his dream is 1941 days to the date it is predicted that President Trump will die on May 9th, 2024, which will be the last Trump sign, which will be an allusion to the phrase the Apostle Paul used in regards to the rapture, the phrase the last trump. President Trump's death is predicted to be 17 days before the rapture. And that's why, although it will be explained in other videos, Trump is associated with the number 17. Just for example, he became president in 2017. All right, it occurred to me to just now check the date that John Lennon was killed. John Lennon was murdered at the Dakota Building in New York City, in Manhattan, right across the street from Central Park in Manhattan. And that was December 8th, 1980, exactly 9 months and 11 days before this extremely prophetic reunion concert in Central Park in New York City, when Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel reunited for the first time in many years. And on that note, it has been learned through learning about the history of the Beatles, because of the Lord using the Beatles in a recent sign as well, and very, very, very important sign, the release of their new song, Now and Then, that was released in November of 2023. Speaking of releases, this video again is about the release of this Seven Psalms album exactly 500 months after this reunion concert. Well, the Beatles released a new song in their virtual reunion, but also right before John Lennon died, Paul McCartney had reunited. He had reconciled with John Lennon, and they were about to start working together again. In fact, from what I understand, they were going to work together that December when John Lennon was killed, but the studio was taken, being used, and so they had to wait a little bit. But the point is that they had reunited. And John Lennon died across the street from Central Park 9 months and 11 days before this reunion in Central Park in Manhattan, the location of the 9/11 events in 2001, the big warning of judgment. And as I explained, all of this is connecting to the date it is predicted that there will be a dirty bomb or suitcase nuke explosion in Manhattan. And so the death of John Lennon, in fact, connects to the bomb, the predicted bomb, on February 3rd, 2024, through this trail of signs in this diagram as well. And so and John Lennon being one of the other big important music composers of the 20th century, of the baby boomer generation, John Lennon died in Manhattan 9 months and 11 days before this reunion in Manhattan in Central Park, which is exactly 500 months to Seven Psalms, and then the 50th prime number to the death of Paul Simon. So the two men's deaths connect. And then in turn, the death of Paul Simon, who is also from New York City, on the date 1/3, hints at 31 days to the date of the predicted bomb in New York City. Anyway, I'm going to now switch over to the remaining diagram here, which will explain the connection between Paul Simon and the Hoover Dam in this theme of like a bridge over troubled water. All right, now, not only is Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water one of the top rated songs of the 20th century, and arguably some would say Paul Simon's best song, but it is a major prophetic sign in God's big picture of signs. And like I am getting at here, God has used the Hoover Dam in connection to all of this. The Hoover Dam is symbolic of like a bridge over troubled water. It is a bridge. The Hoover Dam until 2010 was a major travel route. It was the U.S. Highway 93, and a lot of traffic flowing between Nevada and Las Vegas and Arizona and California passed over the Hoover Dam. It wasn't just a dam, it was actually a bridge over the Colorado River. And U.S. Highway 93 is hinting at the sun, which is 93 million miles away from Earth, as I mentioned a minute ago, earlier. Paul Simon was born on October 13th, 1941, 66 months and 6 days after this date here, in which astronomers that were observing the sun observed highly unusual solar sunspot activity that climaxed with what is described as being, quote, a quite perfect crucifix, unquote, on the surface of the sun. There was this highly unusual solar sunspot activity that then coalesced and climaxed with this quite perfect crucifix on the surface of the sun. On April 8th, 1936, I learned this through other connections in God's big picture of signs back in 2018. Somehow the Lord led me to this knowledge of this event on the surface of the sun on this day. This day is actually 30,000 days exactly to May 27th, 2018, Pentecost in the calendar that watches for new moons. It was a major date in God's signs, and it involved Joshua, and 30,000 chosen ones are in the book of Joshua, which led me to subtract 30,000 days to see what happened on that day. And that's how I discovered this. And furthermore, the other connections are relevant to the sun, related to the connections related to May 27th, 2018. Okay. Now, God uses the number 191 in his signs as symbolism for 9/11, the big warning of judgment in 2001. In other words, it's symbolic of judgment. The quite perfect crucifix on the sun was exactly 191 days after the ceremonial opening of the Hoover Dam, in which the president was in attendance, etc. This is the big symbolic date for the Hoover Dam, September 30th, 1935. Okay? And again, the Hoover Dam is also about U.S. Highway 93. And by the way, it connects to Sin City, Las Vegas. Judgment symbolism, right? And that's why the 191 days followed by 66 months and 6 days, which obviously hints at 666, the number of the Antichrist, to the date that Paul Simon was born. And along the way, we have the sun crucifix. And the sun crucifix connects to U.S. Highway 93, and that's a hint at the sun, which is 93 million miles away from Earth. When the solar storm erupts on the sun that will knock out the nation's power grid, it will be like a dam bursting. Also, the Hoover Dam was built for the purpose of hydroelectric power. It was produced for the power grid, which is why we have all of this sun symbolism embedded in the Hoover Dam itself, with the U.S. Highway 93 and the connection to the crucifix on the sun, because ultimately the big date, February 22nd, 50 days after Paul Simon is predicted to die, is the big solar storm that will knock out the power grid. So I'll just repeat that because this is the big date. And a big connection to this date would be 50 days. And that's the date that Paul Simon is predicted to die. Therefore, the death of Paul Simon will be a huge prophetic sign. All right. By the way, the date 9/30 hints at 3 9s, and the number 9 is the most important number in God's true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections, which is only being explained on this channel, as from the Bible, the number 9 symbolizes God's judgment. Now, the Hoover Dam is involved with electric power generation, and it's related to the sun, and the sun is about to knock out the nation's power grid, and this symbolic Hoover Dam day is, or was, 666,888 hours after the Carrington event. The Carrington event, if you don't know, is this historic eruption of the sun that at the time fried telegraph communication lines. The technology infrastructure for communication was primitive. Had the Carrington event happened in a later time or in our time, the result would be catastrophic. Okay, so there hasn't been a Carrington-like event since then, but scientists say these things are cyclical and we are due for something like a Carrington event. All right. Now, and that's relevant because of what we were talking about here, the sun and electricity with the Hoover Dam. Now, 153 is a number in the Bible, one of 3 unusually specific numbers, and it relates to the second coming. In Jesus' last miracle, 153 fish were caught in the net, which was symbolic of the end of the age of fishing for men and the second coming, which is why the fish were caught 200 cubits from shore, hinting at the second coming after 2,000 years, etc. By the way, 666, the number of the Antichrist, 888, Jesus, the name Jesus in Greek gematria is 888. That's the reason there. Okay, that exactly 153 months after this profound, ceremonial, symbolic date for the Hoover Dam, gets us to the date that president and the president was in attendance at this ceremony. It gets us to this date involving the president. Truman. Yeah. President Truman, on this day, signed into law National Freedom Day. This is an allusion also to the rapture, the liberation of God's faithful into the kingdom, because the biblical worldview is that one's life in this world is a form of slavery to Satan. This world is analogous in the Bible to Egypt. And in Egypt, the Jews, the Israelites, were slaves until their escape, their exodus. And so that is what is hinted at in the context of this truly profound diagram, with National Freedom Day being exactly 153 months after the Hoover Dam Day. National Freedom Day, June 30th, 1948, the day that it was signed into law, is in turn exactly 888 months. And again, 888 symbolizes Jesus. It also symbolizes a new beginning, the 8th level. Like in a scale of notes, for example, the 8th note is the first note in the next level. It gets us to this Freedom Day, June 30th, 2022, which was the day that James Topp finished his march across Canada in Ottawa, which was a parallel with the Freedom Convoy months earlier. He was marching for freedom, freedom from the unrighteous, evil, M-A-N, you know what I'm talking about, M-A-N-D things, right? Everyone should know what I'm talking about. And so anyway, his freedom march climaxed and ended with his arrival in Ottawa on this date, which was exactly 888 months after National Freedom Day. Astounding, beyond words, how the Lord designed that. Now, speaking of the Freedom Convoy, the truckers, the climax of that extremely prophetic sign, which I won't explain in this video, was February 17th, 2022. The 17th day of the second month, which is the date that the flood judgment began in the book of Genesis. This was the day of the tabling of the Emergencies Act, the wicked, evil implementation of the Emergencies Act on the dissenters of the Blue Team in Canada in their wicked civil war, which is in reality a religious war against their arch enemy, conservatives and Christians. Because they don't know it, they are in league and are working for Satan. Now, this Emergencies Act is prophetic for many reasons, which I won't explain in this video, except for one, because it's related to the sun. And that's why on this day, the trailer for the new Elvis movie was released. And this movie is about Elvis and his manager, Colonel Parker. And this date here ties into the Parker probe around the sun signs, which I won't explain here either. But that's why the Parker probe is named Parker. It's because it is an allusion to Colonel Parker, who stole Elvis from Sun Records out of Memphis, Tennessee. Okay, so, and there's king symbolism and all of that. And so I can't go any further into all of that, the significance of Elvis and everything. Okay, but this date, this climax to this sign was 93 days, which hints at the sun that is 93 million miles away from Earth, to this event, which was called in the American media Canada's derecho. A derecho storm is a straight line storm. And it's like a punch. In boxing, a derecho is a type of punch. It's a straight punch. The most destruction of this derecho occurred in Ottawa, because this is a sign God has used to point to the Emergencies Act prophetic sign in Ottawa 93 days earlier. This 93 days connection implies that this derecho storm is hinting at the coming solar storm space weather that will be a punch on North America and knock out its power grid. And I'll show a picture of this in a second, but in the book of Genesis, in the flood account, the flood waters increased for 40 days after they began on the 17th day of the second month. And that's why we have the 40 days from the derecho storm to the day that James Topp arrived in his Freedom March in Ottawa. Now I'll just take a pause here and I'll show you the picture of the derecho storm. All right, here is an image taken from a media site. It's Canada's derecho. The storm, the derecho began, as you can see, literally on the other side of the Ambassador Bridge, which is the biggest trade artery connection between the US and Canada. And this bridge was known for being shut down by the truckers in the Freedom Convoy protest. The Freedom Convoy protest was a straight line. It was a line of truckers across Canada, from Western Canada to Ottawa. It was a straight line. It was like a derecho. It was a parallel line with the border wall of security. I won't get into that symbolism that parallels the book of Joshua, but that border wall is also why the bridge was shut down between the border. But anyway, the reason why this derecho storm begins in Windsor, and a derecho is a wind storm, by the way. It begins in Windsor, literally on the other side of the bridge, because it's hinting at the Freedom Convoy protest. And God's and how that protest was in line with God's anger at the unrighteousness of Canadians and their government. All right. And so that you get the symbolism, you get it, right? The straight line is symbolic of the convoy itself, but it begins at the bridge, which is the big thing about the protest. But this derecho storm began here, but it did most of its damage in Ottawa. 900,000 people were without power. And again, the number 9 is the most important number as it symbolizes God's judgment. So there you have it, Canada's derecho. And by the way, 1/3 of Canadians live within this part of Canada. When we include Montreal and Quebec City, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's like 4/5 or so, 3/5 or something. But it truly is Canada's derecho because most of the Canadian population lives in this corridor right here. All right, now to finish this up, we have from the derecho storm, 900,000 people. We get to James Topp and his arrival in his Freedom March in Ottawa. And that is exactly 99 weeks. And God pairs 9 and 88 together to confirm his signs and connections. And 9, again, symbolic of God's judgment. And that gets us to this date here, just 3 days before the rapture. But this is a rapture sign. This will be the day of the Jupiter-Venus conjunction, which is symbolic of the rapture, which I won't explain. Jupiter symbolizes the body of Christ, and Venus in the Bible is symbolic of Christ and them coming together in the sky is a hint at Bible prophecy and the rapture when God's faithful will meet the Lord in the sky. All right. Now, last on this diagram here is this 86 exact weeks connection between James Topp's Freedom Convoy March arrival in Ottawa to the day of the solar storm, which again connects, as we see in this diagram, to the Emergencies Act. This will be the big emergency, the knocking out of the power grid. And the reason for 86 is because of the 86th word in Strong's Greek and Hebrew concordance, which is the word Hades, In other words, hell, and also to kneel to Satan. So you have to kneel to Satan and Hades with the Greek and Hebrew 86th word in the concordance. And what will be the result of the power grid going out is the rise of the Antichrist through, for example, the rationing of food, which will be rationed to those who have taken the thing, and you know what I'm talking about, the thing that was protested, for example, and that will be enforced, the rationed food, only to those who have taken the thing through programmable digital currency, which is the symbolic significance of the shutting down of the protesters' bank accounts in the Emergencies Act sign. It's hinting at the coming emergency from the solar storm and power grid going out and the rationing of food and the control of people's bank accounts and food only being allowed to be purchased by those who have taken the thing, which is the mark of the Antichrist, described in Bible prophecy, which Bible prophecy says if one takes, they will go to hell. However, nowhere does it say that they cannot repent. So if you have already taken the thing, repent, beg for God's forgiveness. It is a spiritual abomination. And anyway, it is the mark of the Antichrist. So anyway, there you have it. That's how Paul Simon and his birth connects to all of this. The Hoover Dam, like a bridge over troubled water, and electricity, and how it's going to go out with the solar storm and power grid 50 days after Paul Simon's death. All right, a couple more things here, and this should have perhaps been said at the outset, but the Hoover Dam is 726 feet high, and that is extremely prophetic. 726 hints at the 726th word in Strong's Greek New Testament Concordance, which is the word rapture. It is the Greek word that means rapture. And again, the rapture event is the rescue of God's faithful in a bridge over troubled water. Which is why the Hoover Dam, as I'm saying, is symbolic of this bridge over troubled water, and Paul Simon's song, Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water, and the rock-solid confirmation of this prophetic symbolism is the fact that the Hoover Dam is 726 feet high. Also, Ansel Adams, the famous photographer, artist of the American West, his famous Hoover Dam photo by Ansel Adams, Hoover Dam by Ansel Adams, was taken in 1941, the year that Paul Simon was born. And that is more confirmation of this connection between Paul Simon, his song, Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water, and the Hoover Dam. There's another important prophetic sign involving Paul Simon that is related to this theme of like a bridge over troubled water and the rescue, rapture of God's faithful, which is the famous sale of Paul Simon and Edie Brickell's mansion. So Edie Brickell, first of all, is Paul Simon's wife, and she is known for her one big hit with the Edie Brickell and the New Bohemians in, I think it was, well, either 1991 or late 90s. Anyway, so they have been married for a long time, and they have recently sold their mansion in Connecticut. I believe it's Connecticut, or if it's not, it's upstate New York. And the name of the town is New Canaan, which is prophetic. The name itself, New Canaan, hints at the promised land, which is again a theme related to this rapture and the rescue of God's faithful into the kingdom, the promised land, New Canaan. The news story regarding their sale of the mansion, a big part of it and why it was a significant news story it wasn't, one of the top headlines of the year by any means, but it was a story because they had great difficulty selling the mansion. It was originally asked for $13.9 million, and it ended up, and they ended up having to lower their price, their asking price, to $11.9 million. So it, in the end, sold for $11.9 million, and that hints at 9/11, the warning of judgment again. Hence the need for a bridge over troubled water. The property is known for having a pond, a pool, and a waterfall. Edie Brickell's big one-hit song is a repeating chorus. There isn't much lyrics, and one of the big song lines, one of the verses that's repeated that she sings is "Choke me in the shallow water." And this sale is Paul Simon and Edie Brickell's mansion, known for having a pond, a waterfall, and a pool. And her song is her singing about being choked in shallow water. All right. Now, the mansion sold to Richard Gere. A big part of the story was the mystery buyer, which ended up being revealed as Richard Gere, the famous actor who starred in the movie Chicago. The mansion sold on the birthday of the president from Chicago, Barack Obama, the Antichrist. The mansion sold on August 4th, 2022, Barack Obama's birthday. It sold to Richard Gere, who starred in the very famous movie Chicago. And this is why the date that the mansion sold, August 4th, 2022, is 517 days before the date it is predicted that Paul Simon will die on January 3rd. 517 is the 160th semi-prime number, and that hints at 4 times 40. And in other words, the 44th president. And it is from the Antichrist, the 44th president, that people will be rescued. God's faithful will be rescued from the coming severe persecution from the Antichrist, the 44th president. Oh, and I forgot the most important thing about all of this. Jesus said to his faithful that he would be preparing mansions for them. And so that's why this story involving this mansion is part of this theme of rapture and rescue and a bridge over troubled water into heaven the bridge over the troubled water of the end times period of the Antichrist, that will be the rapture into heaven, where there are mansions prepared for God's faithful. And so that's why this is astounding, and that's why this was a story involving Paul Simon's mansion. It's an important story, and again, it was in New Canaan, which hints at the promised land. So this is all amazing.
The following is a clip from the other Paul Simon video. There are 2 Paul Simon videos on this channel. If you have watched the other Paul Simon video, you can, if you want to, you can skip ahead 32 minutes because it is the same information, it's the same clip, it's the same other video. If you want to watch it again, feel free, but you can skip ahead 32 minutes. All right, this video is documenting some of the reasons for how it is known in advance that singer-songwriter Paul Simon will die on February 22nd, 2024. This will be a massive prophetic sign from the righteous Christian God of the Bible. And this is a very profound thing that God is doing. And I'll explain this. Some of this in this video. I've also made another video that must be watched. There are 2 Paul Simon videos. Okay, so this email, which documents this prediction, as you can see, was composed on February 13th. I have known since the beginning of 2023, at least, January, that Paul Simon's death would be a major prophetic sign. Okay? So you can see here, February 13th, the date of the email composition. This email is documenting the prediction that singer-songwriter Paul Simon will die on February 22nd, 2024. In the Bible, the number 50, and by extension the number 5 in God's signs, symbolizes the church of God's people. Like a bridge over troubled water was Simon and Garfunkel's 5th and last album. And the song won 5 Grammy Awards at the 13th Grammy Awards ceremony. Okay, so it's a bunch of 5s there, right? And the number 5 symbolizes the church. Okay, so I'm explaining it now. All right, a couple of things that I forgot to mention in the writing of this paragraph, as well as the first recording of this video. So I'm just interrupting here, the recording. And first of all, the number 5 hints at the number 50, and the number 50 in the Bible is symbolic of the church. The first day of the first Pentecost in the church age was the 50th day. Pentecost literally means 50th day. As well, in Leviticus chapter 25, a 50-year period regards the return of God's people to their original inheritance. Okay, so we have this number 50 hinted at with the number 5, which is why Simon and Garfunkel's 5th album won 5 Grammys. It wasn't the song. The song, Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water, is also the title of the album. So the album won 5 Grammy Awards, including the song. So that's another 5. Anyway, what I failed to mention in the first draft of this video and paragraph is that the date that Paul Simon is predicted to die on February 22nd will be 5 days before it is predicted that Michelle Obama will become the 50th vice president. And the reason why this is the case, the reason for these 2 predictions, 5 days apart, and the prediction for the 50th vice president, Michelle Obama, is that her maiden name is Robinson. And of course, Paul Simon wrote and sung a very, very famous song named Mrs. Robinson. And that is the reason why God is doing this. Paul Simon's death, predicted death on February 22nd, will be 5 days before the 50th Vice President, Michelle Robinson Obama, takes the office, is appointed by Joe Biden, which will be, by the way, after the predicted death of Kamala Harris in a plane crash on February 24th. All right, all of this is being recorded and predicted prior to February 22nd. The date this email is composed as can be seen here is February 13th for that matter. Okay, so keep this in mind as I am drawing out in this video this trail of signs that involve these 50 and these connections involving the number 50. It all leads up to Paul Simon's death 5 days before the 50th Vice President, Michelle Robinson, because Simon wrote the song Mrs. Robinson. So, like a bridge over troubled water is symbolic of the rescue and rapture, as it's called in Christianity, of God's faithful from the coming period of tribulation and the severe persecution from the Antichrist that is described in the book of Revelation in the Bible. Jesus promised his faithful that mansions were being prepared for them in God's kingdom. In 2022, there was a prophetic sign involving the sale of Paul Simon's mansion, which is explained in the other video. Okay, so so you see the connection already? Like a bridge over troubled water is symbolic of the rapture rescue, and Jesus said that those that would be going would have mansions prepared for them. Okay, and that's contained in Paul Simon. So in the Bible, fire is symbolic of the rapture of God's faithful. On the date 1/3, which hinted at the 13th Grammys, this date was actually known ahead of time to be relevant to Paul Simon. It was known for many months, actually. I think even almost a year, that this date, 1/3 in 2024, would be prophetic related to Paul Simon. And as I just explained, Paul Simon is related to mansions. On the date 1/3, there was a prophetic big news story involving the roof of a mansion belonging to a star Miami Dolphins football player. And in God's signs, so I didn't write fire here. It involved a roof fire, the fire of a roof of a mansion. Okay? Now, the reason why fire symbolizes the church is because of the disciples in the upper room on Pentecost, when tongues of fire came down. And here we have a roof as an upper room sign, this roof fire of the mansion. And in God's signs, the number 13 is symbolic of the Miami Dolphins. Okay, there's a big reason for that. I won't get into it here. I'm going to spare that. It's explained in another video. But anyway, that's why the date 1/3. And again, Paul Simon, his last album, the 5th album that won 5 Grammys, was at the 13th Grammy Awards, which was why the date 1/3 was first realized in the first place. Simon's only number 1 hit as a solo artist, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, hints at the 50 days. Well, why don't we just get into this just very quickly? The Miami Dolphins are known or associated with the number 13 in God's signs for this reason. The Chicago Bears of the '85 season are known to be the best team in football history, except they didn't have a perfect record. The '72 Dolphins, 13 years earlier, were the only team in NFL history to have a perfect record. The reason why the Bears didn't have a perfect record in '85, which was the year, by the way, that Barack Obama moved to Chicago, which is the significance of this, The reason why is because they lost one game in that season to the Miami Dolphins, and it was in week 13 of the season. And it was because the quarterback, number 13 for the Dolphins, had a quick style of offense that was able to defeat the Bears defense, which is the reason why the Bears were so good. They had a revolutionary style of defense that year. Okay, now the 72 Dolphins won the Super Bowl, obviously, because they had an undefeated season, and the MVP in that Super Bowl was number 13. And that was 13 years before the 85 Dolphins. But the player, the MVP, was a safety, which is highly unusual for a safety to be the MVP of a Super Bowl. But that hints at the safety, or lack of, because of the Antichrist, the safety of God's people and America. Now, because Barack Obama is a Chicago sports fan, he had the 85 Bears visit him at the White House. That was on the Day of Atonement in the Hebrew calendar, but it was also the 10th day of the 7th month in the Gregorian calendar, and in the Hebrew calendar, the Day of Atonement is the 10th day of the 7th month. Sorry, it was the 7th day of the 10th month in the Gregorian, but it's still a 7 and a 10. It's, in other words, symbolism for the Day of Atonement in God's signs. This isn't the only example. That Day of Atonement in 2011, when the 85 Bears, which by the way, 85 hints at 8 plus 5 equals 13, that 85 Bears team that lost to the Dolphins, which is symbolized by the number 13, that visit to Obama at the White House was exactly 13 years before the Day of Atonement in 2024, which will be the day of the defeat of the Antichrist at the Lord's return, the second coming. Okay, so that's the reason for the 13 here. Okay, and also the two Antichrists are described in Revelation chapter 13. Now, the 85 Bears began a 30-year cycle because they won the Super Bowl in 86. And in the Bible, 30 years is symbolic of a king. The 85 Bears victory began a 30-year cycle in which all of the major sports teams in Chicago won their championships. And they were all prophetic and all pointed to Barack Obama. The last one was the Chicago Cubs that broke their sports curse, which hinted at the curse of the Antichrist. And they visited Obama and presented him with jersey number 44. And it was star player number 44 that gave him the jersey. And that was 4 days before he left the White House in 2017. So that's the completion of the 30-year cycle, and it aligns with the rise of Barack Obama, the Antichrist king. Now, I went off on a tangent, but I think it was worth it because we need to establish the significance of the Miami Dolphins and the players' roof fire on the date 1-3, which hints at 13. So we definitely have a prophetic sign with this fire in the roof, okay? And that hints at Paul Simon because of his prophetic sign involving the sale of his mansion on the Antichrist's birthday in 2022, which is explained in the other video. Okay, so now let's move on, okay? And I began by saying how, we've got the number 50, right? Because the fifth album won 5 Grammys, all right? Now, Simon's only number 1 hit as a solo artist was the song 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover. And this hints at the 50 days, as in 50 ways, from this prophetic roof fire in the mansion to the date it is predicted that Paul Simon will die. Okay? The date 1-3, which is 50 days before it is predicted that Paul Simon will die, and again, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover hints at that. The date 1-3 was in turn 229 days, and 229 is the 50th prime number, after the release of his new album, 7 Psalms, on May 19th, 2023. Now, 7 Psalms, he said he got the name for it from a dream. He had a vivid dream in which he was told that the new project he's working on is 7 Psalms, which hints at the book of Revelation and the letters that Jesus wrote to the 7 churches. And again, we're talking about mansion and like a bridge over troubled water and the rescue of God's faithful. Okay? Now, so the new album was released and the theme of it is death, which is hinting at Paul Simon's death. Now, that album was released on May 19th, 2023. And by the way, it's an interesting album on a side note, if you want to listen to it. The theme of which involves the end of life. Okay, the theme of this album involves the end of life and death. The name 7 Psalms hints at the book of Revelation and the 7 trumpet judgments, 7 seals, and 7 bowls of judgment, but also the 7 churches, like I was saying. The release of 7 Psalms was in turn exactly 500 months, here's that number 50 again, after Simon and Garfunkel's historic reunion concert when they played for 500,000 people in Central Park in Manhattan on September 19th, 1980. All right? So, okay, and Paul Simon in Hebrew gematria equals 500. So I'm just going to do that again now. From the historic concert, the reunion concert, the very famous one in which 500,000 people attended, and Paul Simon's name equals 500, it is exactly 500 months to the release of Paul Simon's new album, which is about theme of end of life and death, which is 229 days, which is the 50th prime number, to the mansion sign, which is 50 days, as in 50 ways to leave your lover, to the date it is predicted Paul Simon will die. Now, one more thing here. The date of the concert in Central Park was exactly 188. Now, God uses the number 188 in his signs frequently because the 188th word, H188 in Strong's Concordance, is the Hebrew word that means woe, ! And is used in the context of extreme judgment from God. And the concert was exactly 188 months after the release of Homeward Bound, the song, on January 19th, 1966. John Lennon died across the street from Central Park 9 months and 11 days, which hints at 9/11, in Manhattan, before Simon and Garfunkel's reunion in Central Park. Okay, that's making it a tangent. I'm not going to explain John Lennon here, but his death is connected to this, which is connected to the death of Paul Simon, which is connected to this theme of the Lord returning and rescuing his faithful in a rapture, and those who will be raptured will be homeward bound, because their home isn't in this world, it is in God's kingdom. And that is the reason for this exact 188 months, which is woe ! Between the concert and the Homeward Bound song. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, lived in his Graceland estate, which is symbolism for a king's palace. Graceland is located in Memphis, Tennessee, which is named after Memphis, Egypt, which is symbolism for the king of Egypt in the Bible, who persecuted God's people. In the Bible, the king of Egypt is symbolism for the Antichrist. After the Israelites' exodus from Egypt and the king of Egypt, they wandered in the desert under God's guidance for 40 years before entering the Promised Land. The name Graceland is also symbolic of the Promised Land. Okay, and I didn't mention yet, Paul Simon I'm going to mention it in a second. Okay. On 2/22 in 1984, Elvis's Lisa Marie plane was homeward bound, as in the Simon and Garfunkel song Homeward Bound, from Florida to the Graceland estate. And Okay, Paul Simon has a huge album named Graceland, which I'll get to in a sec. There was a large celebration in Memphis for this event. And they closed down the streets to get the plane from the airport to the estate, and they had a parade and everything. It was a huge celebration, okay? And the mayor declared that the date 2/22 in 1984, or declared it in 1984, but this date 2/22 to be Lisa Marie Day in Memphis. And this is all, by the way, of course, prophetic, because Kamala Harris is predicted to die in a plane crash and be replaced by Barack Obama, which will symbolize when Jesus said he saw Satan falling like lightning from heaven, and on the back of the plane of the Lisa Marie, there is a lightning bolt. Well, anyway, okay. But we're talking about this positive celebration here, okay? This celebration of the homeward bound airplane is symbolic of the rescue, rapture, and celebration of God's faithful in the clouds to meet the King of Kings, as described in Bible prophecy. What I forgot to write here is that the day of the homeward bound Lisa Marie plane with the lightning bolt on the back of on the tail, this was exactly 6 years, 6 months, and 6 days after Elvis Presley died. And on the day that he died, the Lisa Marie plane had landed in Memphis carrying his daughter from California. And she was 9 years old. The number 9 symbolizes God's judgment, but Paul Simon in the song Graceland is singing about his pilgrimage to Graceland with his 9-year-old son. And that too connects to Paul Simon. Okay, and the rescue of God's faithful and this celebration that's being alluded to here will be from the Antichrist, whose number in Bible prophecy is 666, the Antichrist king, which is what Memphis, Egypt, and all of this is hinting at, right? In the king's palace, the Graceland estate. It's a dual symbolism. Of course, it's hinting at the promised land, like I'm saying too, but it's also symbolism for the king's palace. And the king of rock and roll lived there, right? And Memphis is named after Memphis, Egypt. So, all right. But that's just amazing. You know, the king died 6 years, 6 months, and 6 days before the return of this plane. Wow. Okay. Now, I'm glad I remembered that to put it in this video. Okay, so 2/22 in 1984, Elvis's Lisa Marie plane was homeward bound, as in the Simon and Garfunkel Homeward Bound song, from Florida to the Graceland estate. There was a large celebration in Memphis, and the mayor declared the day to be Lisa Marie Day. The celebration, the parade, the closing down of the streets so that they could get the plane to the estate, etc. This celebration of the homeward bound airplane is symbolic of the rescue, rapture, and celebration of God's faithful in the clouds to meet the King of Kings, as described in Bible prophecy, because of course the plane had to fly to get to Memphis in the clouds. Paul Simon's biggest successful solo album was Graceland. In the song Graceland, he sings about making a pilgrimage to Graceland. Many people from all over make pilgrimages to the King's Graceland. And as explained in the James Earl Jones video, Graceland is also symbolic of the Temple Mount, and in the Messianic age, people from all over the world will be making pilgrimages to worship the Lord, who will be dwelling on the Temple Mount. Okay, so that's that parallel with pilgrimages, and that's the song Graceland. It's about Paul Simon's pilgrimage to the King's Graceland estate. The homeward bound Lisa Marie to the King's Graceland estate on February 22nd, 222, which by the way hints at the second coming, and the celebration therefore of God's faithful. Okay, on 2/22 in 1984, that's a typo, in 1984 is exactly 40 years, as in the Israelites in the desert before entering the promised land Okay? So the Lisa Marie returning to the Graceland estate, as in the Promised Land, was 40 years, as in the Israelites before they entered the Promised Land, before it is predicted that Paul Simon will die. Paul Simon and Like a Bridge Over Troubled Water are symbolic of the second coming and the rescue rapture into the Promised Land, the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, which is why the king's plane returned to Graceland on the date 2/2, which hints at the second coming, and why Simon is predicted to die on the date 2/22. This is amazing. I hope you got that, because Graceland is Egypt symbolism and Promised Land symbolism, and the day that the Lisa Marie plane returned, Homeward Bound, is the day that the writer of the song Homeward Bound predicted to die 40 years later, as in 40 years before the Israelites entered the Promised Land, after their exodus from Egypt. It's so amazing. All right, one last thing. The Antichrist is the 44th president. The Miracle on Ice hockey game, in which Team USA in the Olympics in America miraculously beat the Soviets during the Cold War, during a particular low moment of the Cold War for America. And then they leaped into the air in a euphoric celebration, which will be exactly 44 years, as in the 44th president, before it is predicted that Paul Simon will die. Paul Simon is symbolic of the rapture and rescue of God's faithful from the Antichrist, like a bridge over troubled water, who will then celebrate God's faithful. Okay, so Paul Simon is symbolism or symbolic of the rapture and rescue of God's faithful from the 44th president Antichrist, who will then celebrate. Which is why Paul Simon is predicted to die 44 years exactly after this miracle on ice, as in the miracle of the disappearance of God's faithful who will not die, disappear, and go to heaven, and then return with the Lord at his second coming. This miracle will be symbolized with this 44 exact years after the Miracle on Ice hockey game, in which the team, after they won and beat the Soviets, leaped into the air, as in the prophecy about the Lord's faithful being taken up into the air, into the clouds to meet the Lord. They leaped into the air. The hockey players leaped into the air in a euphoric celebration, along with everyone in the stadium, including the prophetic announcer Al Michaels, and his saying that, "Do you believe in miracles?" at the moment of the victory, in genuine, sincere love of what he had just seen. The Miracle on Ice hockey game, this big moment, probably the most famous moment in American sports history, is a prophetic sign from God that is communicating exactly 44 years to the death of Paul Simon, who is symbolic, as I have explained, of the rescue and rapture of God's faithful into the Promised Land, Graceland, who will then celebrate. The disappearance of God's faithful from earth into the kingdom of heaven will be a miracle. Now I will explain how the death of Paul Simon and these signs from the righteous Christian God of the Bible reveal the date of the resurrection rapture, which will be on May 26th, 2024. Pentecost in the calendar that watches for new moons. The reason why God has given me a voice through this prediction, and I want to say this as humbly as possible, is to prove this. This is the reason for the prediction. Please understand that I know far better than you why the purpose of this prediction and the reason why this video and video channel. It is to prove this. It is to prove that the resurrection rapture is May 26th, 2024. Case closed. That is the purpose of the prediction. This is how prophecy works. How is this the case? Pentecost symbolizes the church, and Pentecost literally means 50th day. And as we have seen in this video and this explanation, God has used these connections involving the number 50 with Paul Simon. Paul Simon will die 5 days before the 50th U.S. Vice President, Michelle Robinson Obama, on February 27th. February 27th, 227, hints at 227, which is the 49th prime number. In the Omer count, in Leviticus chapter 23, we have a 49 and a 50 days count from the Feast of First Fruits. And so this is also why Michelle Robinson Obama will become the 50th vice president on the date that hints at the number 49. This is why from this date, 227, and the 50th vice president, it is 2 months and 29 days to the resurrection rapture on Pentecost. 2 months and 29 days hints at 229, which is the 50th prime number. And so from the date that hints at 49, we have a 50 connection, which parallels and hints at the Omer count of 49 days and 50 days from the Feast of First Fruits to the Feast of Pentecost, which means 50th day. And as if you recall, I explained earlier how the Mansion fire sign was 229 days, for example, after the release of Paul Simon's new album. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this 229 days connection hints at the number 50, the 50th prime number. That's why we also have this 2 months and 29 days hint at the number 50 to Pentecost, which literally means 50th. Also, Michelle Robinson Obama is predicted to become the 47th president 2 days after she becomes the 50th vice president, on the date it is predicted that Joe Biden will step down on February 29th, the date 229, which hints at 229, the 50th prime number. This is merely scratching the surface of the reasons for how this prediction is known in advance. For more information, please visit bitchute.com or odyssey.com, spelled ODYSEE.com, video channels named Harris Crash Prediction, and also read the website trumpprediction.com. All right, now I am going to explain the prophetic signs, the profound, important prophetic signs that occurred on January 3rd, and it will also in the process be explained how this is relevant to Paul Simon. Be patient. The explanation I am about to read will not be entirely about Paul Simon. In fact, it is about a great many other things, which is typical of God's true big picture. I should say big picture of God's prophetic signs, patterns, and connections, which is only being explained on this channel. His big picture incorporates many things. It's an interconnected web. It is like the Bible.
the Bible cannot be properly understood. You can't isolate parts of the Bible without appreciating their context to the rest of the book. And so that's the case as well with God's signs. And so it's all interconnected. But nonetheless, you will see at the end of this how it all connects to Paul Simon, and how it also reveals adding 10 days to January 3rd to get January 13th, the date it is now predicted that Paul Simon will die. So let's get into it. This is an email that I wrote to friends explaining what happened. So I'm just going to read it. Okay, it was speculated that there will be 2 blasts in Manhattan, and that these blasts will be on January 3rd, 2024, which will be 31 days after the date 1-3, January 3rd. 31 hints at 1-3. On 1-3, there were 2 blasts in Iran at the site of General Soleimani's grave. 84 people were killed in the bombings. This was exactly 48 months after trumpet, God's trumpet that he uses to trumpet and highlight his prophetic signs, had Soleimani killed with a drone's missile in an explosion. 84 people in these bombings hints at the 48 months earlier when Soleimani was killed. Because again, these bombings were at the site of Soleimani's grave. That's astounding. 84 people hints at 48. This hints at the future 48th president, who was born on 8/4, August 4th. Also, the end times period of the Antichrist is in Bible prophecy symbolized with 84 months. So 7 years, 12 months, each 84 months. Daniel chapter 9. Okay. The first of the 2 bombs was 2,300 feet from Soleimani's grave. This is in the news article. 2,300 feet. 2,300 feet hints at the 2,300 days period associated with the Antichrist in Daniel chapter 8. And this prophecy in chapter 8 is about Persia, which renamed itself Iran in 1935. So Persia is Iran. And that's why it is astounding we have the 2,300 number in this prophecy, because that is what is in the prophecy regarding Persia in Daniel chapter 8. I should say 2,300 feet in this prophetic sign, because there's 2,300 there's the number 2,300 in the prophecy about Persia in Daniel chapter 8. As well, 2,300 feet hints at Obama's high school jersey number, and that's the point here is also. Again, that's the reason for the 84 deaths 48 months after Soleimani's death in an explosion. It also hints at the date of the predicted explosions in Manhattan on the date 2-3, which hints at the number 23. The date of these explosions on January 3rd, 2024 in Iran hints at the number 13. The date 1-3 hints at the number 13. Haman persecuted the Jews on the 2 13th days of the month in the book of Esther in the Bible. This was the prophetic significance of General Soleimani's death, who was symbolism for Haman in the Bible. And that's because Haman wasn't the king. He was like a general. Okay? This was the prophetic significance of General Soleimani's death on the date 1-3, which hints at 13 in 2020. That's why, in other words, Soleimani died on the date 1-3 because it hints at 13, and Haman persecuted the Jews on the 2 13th days of the month. In other words, the number 13 symbolizes the Antichrist, but one of the reasons why is because of the book of Esther and Haman. Soleimani is symbolism for Haman, like I just said. It is predicted that Israel will bomb Iran on February 26th, 2024, in response to the predicted explosions in Manhattan that are predicted. Again, the predicted bombings in Manhattan will be 31, which hints at 13. It's a reflection of 13 days after the explosions in Iran on 1/3, which hints at 13. What confirms all of this analysis regarding the number 13 on the date 1/3, and therefore this 31 days from 1/3 to the predicted explosions in Manhattan, is the news story regarding star Dolphins receiver Tyreek Hill's mansion fire on 1/3. This is because in God's signs, the Dolphins symbolize the number 13. Briefly, the Dolphins were the only team to beat the 85 Bears, 1985 Chicago Bears, and 8 plus 5 equals 13. 85 hints at 13. And 1985 was the year that the Antichrist Obama moved to Chicago, and God uses Chicago in his signs for symbolism to point to Barack Obama, the Antichrist. Okay, so again, the Dolphins were the only team to beat the 85 Bears, which hints at 13. This defeat, in other words, the Bears won the Super Bowl. They won every single game in the season and in the playoffs, except for the one game against the Dolphins. This defeat on Monday Night Football was in week number 13. And the reason why the Dolphins were able to overcome the 85 Bears' famous defense, which is why they were so successful. They dominated. Not only did they win every game, they completely dominated all of their opponents because they revolutionized a new defensive strategy that the other teams couldn't compete with in that year. It was brand new. No one had seen it before. So the Bears are famous for their defense. However, in this one loss, the Miami Dolphins offense was able to overcome the Bears defense because their weakness was the quick passing offensive strategy and play action of quarterback Dan Marino, Hall of Fame quarterback Dan Marino, who wore jersey number 13. And this was in week 13 of the NFL season. Okay, the 85 Bears was 13 years after the Dolphins were the first and only ever team to go undefeated. So the 85 Bears almost became an undefeated team, except they lost one game to the Dolphins. And coincidentally, the Dolphins were the only team to ever have an undefeated season. And that season was 13 years prior to the Bears season. It's amazing. In the 1972 Dolphins, that's what we're talking about, 13 years before 1985, in the 72 Dolphins Super Bowl win, player number 13 won the MVP. And this stood out even more. This was highlighted even further with the fact that the player was a safety. I don't believe there has ever been a safety position player other than this one to ever have won the MVP. I could be wrong, but that's highly, highly unusual. A safety. No. Safeties don't win the MVP. But anyway, there's also a reason why, which isn't explained in this video, the player was at the safety position. It has to do with the Miami Miracle and Rob Gronkowski. Anyway, that's explained in the 49ers Dolphins video, which was produced at the beginning of this year's season, and it predicts that the 49ers will beat the Dolphins in the Super Bowl. And as of the date of this recording, the playoffs still haven't started. And so anyway, make sure you watch that video when the prediction comes to pass. Not only am I predicting the winner of this year's Super Bowl, but I'm also predicting who they will play. The Dolphins. So anyway, back to what we were talking about. So I'm explaining how the number 13 is synonymous in God's signs with the Miami Dolphins. Okay, I think you're getting the picture now. The reason for all of this is that the 85 Bears, and what I mean is that the reason for all of this 13 with the association with the Dolphins and their win against the 85 Bears is because the 85 Bears visited Obama at the White House on the Day of Atonement in 2011. Exactly 13 years before Obama, the Antichrist's defeat on the Day of Atonement in 2024. Okay, so it was a revealing through God's signs, the day of the second coming of Lord Jesus Christ. This is the reason for all of these 13s. And you could even interpret the safety position as also being symbolism for Christ and those that are in Christ. Their safety in Christ from the devil and his representative, the Antichrist. So, all right, so that's why all of this is amazing. Now, the 85 Bears visited Obama, just so you know, at the White House because back in 1985, it wasn't a tradition for sports teams to visit the White House after every championship in every league. This is the case these days. It's a promotional opportunity for presidents. But back in 1985, that wasn't the case. And Obama, because of prophetic reasons from God, but Obama had the 85 Bears visit him at the White House because, well, that was the year that he moved to Chicago, and he was a Bears fan in that year, and he just thought it would be cool to have them come to the White House. But little did he know that it was revealing how he will be defeated by the return of Lord Jesus Christ, exactly 13 years later. Okay. In fact, not only did the 85 Bears visit Obama on the Day of Atonement in 2011, but the date that they visited him in 2011 was October 7th, 10/7 in the Gregorian calendar. The Day of Atonement is 10/7 in the Hebrew calendar. Okay? Additionally, Pence and Harris debated on 10/7 in 2020. It was a prophetic sign, the fly in Pence's hair, if you remember, for 2 minutes on the day of 2,000 lightning strikes over the Charles River and on and on. Okay, but also on this day, the Dolphins organization rejected the governor of Florida's removal of the restriction to limit spectator capacity in the stadium to 13,000, and instead the Dolphins chose to continue with the corrupt, this organization here, you know what I'm talking about. If you're watching the video, you can see it. Guidelines, okay? The thing that gives the guidelines regarding the CVD disease, this was in 2020, okay? And their guidelines were for stadiums to not have more than 13,000 spectators spread out. However, the governor and the state of Florida overturned that, or rather they decided at this point that this no longer needed to be enforced, and that the Dolphins, if they chose to, could have full capacity in the stadium. But the limit from the corrupt organization the guideline was for 13,000. And the Dolphins chose to remain with it. Anyway, again, another example of how the number 13 is synonymous with the Miami Dolphins. Okay, so this 13,000 spectators story was exactly 9 years after 10-7 in 2011. God pairs 9 and 13 together to confirm his signs. And this is how God's true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections works. It works on the principle of second and third and multiple witnesses confirming a matter as the Bible says is required. And this is what makes what is being explained on this channel true and not a product of one's imagination, and different and unique than everything else on the internet that claims to be an analysis of God's prophetic signs. And when we think about it, one simple way in which God would provide a second witness for us is through pairing certain numbers together, especially the number 9 with other numbers together, certain other numbers. And the reason why I know this is because I have been studying God's true big picture of signs, patterns, and connections, which is only being explained on this channel from morning until night for more than full-time hours for the last 6 years. Okay, so God pairs 9 and 13 to confirm his signs, okay? Which is why the 13,000 spectators story was exactly 9 years after 10-7 in 2011 with the 85 Bears. And again, the only game that they lost was against the Dolphins. And by the way, after the Bears visited Obama at the White House, the Dolphins complained, the 72 Dolphins complained, tongue-in-cheek, because Obama at the time of the Bears visit said that they were the best team in history. However, it was the Dolphins that beat them that year, and the Dolphins were the only team, the 72 Dolphins were the only team to have ever had an undefeated season. So they were like, well, what are you talking about? And so then Obama had the 72 Dolphins visit him at the White House. And by the way, that video is exactly not, when I say that video, I mean the White House official video of the visit on the Obama White House YouTube channel is exactly 9 minutes, if I recall. I could be wrong, but I think that was the case. Anyway, that would be a pairing of 9 and 13 because, again, the Dolphins are synonymous with the number 13. Okay, so God pairs 9 and 13 to confirm his signs, and 9 times 13 equals 117. And by the way, one of the reasons why he pairs 9 and 13 is because the number 9 from the Bible symbolizes God's judgment. It is the most important number in God's prophetic signs. And the number 13 symbolizes the Antichrist. Nimrod, a type for the Antichrist, persecuted the Jews was the 13th generation from Adam. Haman, another type for the Antichrist, persecuted the Jews on the 2 13th days of the month. And the two Antichrists are described in the book of Revelation in chapter 13. Okay, so 9 times 13 equals 117. And God has been using this number for symbolism for the mark of the Antichrist. You'll have to take my word for that. And when the prediction comes to pass, it'll prove everything that I am saying. The things especially that I'm saying, take my word for it. And that is the point of the prediction, by the way. The reason for why God has given this prediction and given me a voice through this prediction is to prove these certain things, especially the controversial things. Not that this is particularly controversial, but the controversial thing that I said earlier about the second coming being in 2024, 13 years after the Bears visited Obama at the White House. Make no mistake. The reason why God has given me a voice is to prove this through this prediction. The reason for the prediction is to prove that the second coming is on October 12th, 2024. Period. No debate or controversy at all. It is the day of the second coming. Okay, it is like the center of the web.
And this prediction will prove that this is God's true big picture of signs in a web. It is a web of signs, and it'll be proven to be true when the prediction comes to pass. And to not appreciate this is to miss entirely the point of the prediction and the point of this video and video channel. And like I say, if you are going to refuse to accept the conclusion that the Day of Atonement, for example, or rather the Second Coming will be on the Day of Atonement in 2024, then I like to say, you might as well turn off the video now. You are wasting your time. All right, so now that we've gotten that out of the way, again, the number 117 is symbolic of the mark of the Antichrist. 9 times 13 hints at judgment from the Antichrist, as I just explained. And the mark of the Antichrist is the CVD thing. You know what I'm talking about. The thing that you can't talk about is the mark of the Antichrist. And here we go again. That is another reason for the prediction. Make no mistake. And the commonly held objections that people have based on their understanding of Bible prophecy are answered in the must-watch snake bite video. All right? So, case closed. No more debate, no more discussion at all, period. Case closed. It is the mark of the Antichrist in its current form. It does not need an additional something, such as an additional technology or false form of religious worship to go with it. And nor does it need a new supposed age of dispensation after all Christians will be, after quote unquote, all Christians will be supposedly raptured. In fact, one of the reasons why a vast majority of, or rather a large number of Christians have, quote unquote, Christians have taken the mark of the Antichrist already is that it is judgment for this particular doctrine. As Jesus said, he is coming to make war with the sword of his mouth on those that teach and have the works that are a product of this doctrine. All right, so let's move on. But the mark of the Antichrist is the thing, case closed, in its current form. All right, but nowhere in the Bible does it say that one cannot repent after taking it. So watch the snake bite video. This Dolphins 13,000 spectators story on 10/7/2020 was also 48 months before Atonement in 2024 and the defeat of the 48th president, Antichrist. The predicted future 48th president, Barack Obama. The point being is that this dolphin's symbolism for the number 13 mansion fire story on 1/3, the day of the explosions in Persia. Okay, so I've gone on so long, you might have at this point forgotten what I've been talking about, okay? We were talking about the Dolphins player's fire at his mansion on January 3rd, 2024, okay? That was the prophetic sign. I'm in the process of explaining it, okay? So, and that was on the same day as the explosions in Persia, okay? Persia is symbolized by 13, as are the dolphins. So, the point being is that this dolphins symbolism for the number 13 mansion fire story on 1/3, which hints at 13, the day of the explosions in Persia, which is symbolized by 13 because of Haman, like I was saying earlier, confirms the prophetic significance of the explosions in Iran, again, 13, on the date 1/3, which hints at 13, thereby confirming the 31, which is a reflection of 13 days from 1/3, which hints at 13, to the predicted explosion in Manhattan, which will lead to Israel bombing Iran, which will be 23 days later, and the bomb in Iran, predicted to be 23 days later, and the bomb in Iran and the bombs in Iran on 1/3 were, the first one was 2,300 feet from the grave of Soleimani, who is symbolic of Haman, who is symbolized by the number 13. Another interesting thing is that the Miami Dolphins are being used in God's signs for sun symbolism. For one thing, the Dolphins logo contains a depiction of the sun. Okay, so if you know the logo, I don't have a
Well, let me see. Anyway, well, you just take my word for it. In the logo, there's a sun. Okay, the sun is depicted quite clearly. It's an integral part of the logo of the Dolphins and has been so since the Dolphins became a team. This Dolphins Mansion Fire sign is 50 days. All right, so here you can see the Miami Dolphins logo. Clearly, this is a sun that is active. This is the surface of the sun right here. You could interpret these as sun rays that you're seeing in the atmosphere through your visual through your eyes. Like you're interpreting these sun rays through your vision. But that either way, this is clearly sun activity. This is solar. This is symbolism in God's signs anyway. Is what I'm saying. This is symbolism for solar flares and sun explosion activity. Okay, so there you go. All right, so back to what I was saying again. The Miami Dolphins players' mansion fire is 50 days before the eruption on the sun. And recall that, January 3rd, the day of the mansion fire, is 50 days to the sun event, as I explained earlier in this video. And that's also hinted at with Paul Simon with his 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover song. Okay? Okay, so the chiefs symbolize Pentecost and fire. I just explained all of that, right? However, Tyreek Hill, the star Dolphins player whose mansion caught fire, signed with the Dolphins for $120 million. 120 is the number from Pentecost in the book of Acts in the Bible, after playing for the Chiefs, which symbolize Pentecost. And he played with them for years, including in their Super Bowl win 50 years after their prior Super Bowl win. Okay? So because it's Tyreek Hill and he played for the Chiefs, and the Chiefs are about the number 50, this Tyreek Hill sign confirms the 50 days to the fire on the sun. And it's his mansion fire sign. And the fire was in the upper room of the mansion, which hints at the high place and the sun. It also hints at the upper room on Pentecost that the 120 disciples were waiting in. So as I wrote, additionally, Hill's mansion fire was said to have originated in and was contained to the attic area, the upper room, perfect upper room symbolism. And not only, and by the way, in the story too, the aerial footage focuses on the big giant hole in the roof with smoke coming out of it after the firefighters came and put the big hole in the roof to put out the fire. Okay. So this is perfect upper room symbolism. And not the only time God used an attic fire for this Pentecost upper room tongues of fire symbolism. I won't get into it, but there was the fire in the attic upper level of a building in Paradise Boulevard in Las Vegas on Pentecost. But, that's explained in another video somewhere. What is also interesting is that it was speculated, and by the way, that Pentecost was, let's see if I can recall. I think it was 2019. What is also interesting is that it was speculated that God was, and the relevance of that fire, I just can't explain in this video, so I just got to keep moving on, not go off onto a rabbit trail. Okay, what is also interesting is that it was speculated that God was pointing to the date 1/3, January 3rd, with the number 50 symbolism from Paul Simon signs. as explained in the very interesting Paul Simon video, which I already explained, which, again, to refresh your memory, January 3rd was 229 days, and 229 is the 50th prime number after the release of Seven Psalms album, which was exactly 500 months after 500,000 people attended the reunion concert, and on and on. Okay? Paul Simon symbolism is tied to the church because of Bridge Over Troubled Water, the song Graceland, and as explained in the video, Simon is tied to the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam points to the rapture. Again, the dam is 726 feet high. The 726th word in the Greek concordance is the word rapture, which will be a bridge over troubled water. And points, okay, the Hoover Dam also points to the coming solar flare because of the busy U.S. Highway 93 and the sun being 93 million miles away from Earth. The Hoover Dam was built for generating power, and the coming solar flare will knock out the power. So it seems the analysis of the connections between Paul Simon and the date 1-3 was correct. Tyreek Hill's mansion fire was the expected sign. Furthermore, part of the connections from Paul Simon to 1-3, January 3rd, is the story of the sale of his mansion. Therefore, Hill's mansion fire fits this as well. By the way, the story, if you recall earlier in the video, about Paul Simon's mansion was about water. And Hill's mansion is about fire. This is just coming to me right now, by the way. And Peter said that unlike the first judgment by water, the coming judgment will be symbolized by fire, which will be the fire from the sun. And which will fulfill what Peter said. But, and that's the point, yeah? So there's the contrast here, in other words, between Hill's mansion and Paul Simon's mansion, which is more confirmation. Okay, Bridge Over Troubled Water from Simon and Garfunkel's fifth album won 5 awards at the 13th Grammys, which hints at the date 1-3. I'll attach the diagrams if you don't have time to watch the video, but I do recommend still watching the video, okay? You guys have already watched the video, so let's move on. Also, the ex-chief's, which is symbolism for Pentecost, receiver's name, Tyreek Hill, is symbolic of Pentecost. Hill equals high place. On the first Pentecost, fire came down on Mount Sinai, and tongues of fire came down on the upper room on the first Pentecost of the church age. Okay, hence why the attic fire in Hill's mansion. Amazing. Also, I remembered that it was Hill who caught the pass in the prophetic play of the game in Super Bowl 54. The Stinger play. The play was named Stinger. Okay, this is the famous big play of the game. The game-changing play. This huge pass, okay? A pass from the Chiefs' 22-yard line caught by thrown. Okay, so the quarterback for the Chiefs backed up and then threw the ball from his 22-yard line. And then the ball was caught by Hill at the other 22-yard line, the 49ers' 22-yard line, and it was a 44-yard pass, meaning that the gain on the play was 44 yards, which hints at the 44th president. This was on the date 2-2 in 2022. That's a typo. It was 2020, which is still 2-2, 2020, right? And the coach for the Chiefs won his first ever Super Bowl in his 222nd career win. This was a part of the news story, and one of the biggest news headlines after the game was this veteran coach who'd been in the league forever but had never won a Super Bowl, finally won his first Super Bowl in his 222nd career win. So you have a lot of twos here, if you noticed, right? The play was from the 22-yard line to the other 22-yard line on the date 2-2 in 2020, and the coach's 222nd win. Why is this? This pointed to the mark of the Antichrist. Okay, the number 22 in God's signs is symbolism for the mark of the Antichrist, which is what the stinger hints at, because the mark of the Antichrist is the thing. It is a snake bite, but it is also symbolized by stingers in Revelation chapter 8, for example. Okay? So you know what a stinger hints at, right? It hints at the thing that is put into the person. Right? You know what I'm talking about. The reason why number 22 is because the inverse of the mark of the Antichrist is described in Ezekiel chapter 9, and it would have been a Tav mark, and the Tav letter is the last letter and 22nd letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And the mark of the Antichrist is described in the last book of the Bible, which is the 22nd out of 22 books in the Bible that have a total of 22 chapters. This is why the number 22 in God's signs symbolizes the mark of the Antichrist. Okay, and that's the reason for all of these twos. This is huge. Okay, what I didn't, So Hill caught this play. Not only so, this confirms the prophetic relevance of Hill being tied back to the Chiefs in this prophetic Hill Mansion sign. Okay, that's what I'm getting at here. I'm going somewhere with this, but you're starting to get the idea here. We've got church symbolism, big time, with the number 50 and the fire and all of that, right? Chiefs winning their first Super Bowl in 50 years, and this fire mansion sign 50 days before the sun fire, and okay. And you got the mark of the Antichrist symbolism here. So what's the point? Well, the mark of the Antichrist is for the purpose of testing the faith of quote-unquote Christians. That's the purpose of the Antichrist and the mark of the Antichrist. It is, for that matter, the primary purpose of the end times period that we are in. That's the purpose of it, is to test the faith of quote-unquote Christians. Okay? So that they can demonstrate their faith, which is necessary, which, by the way, is alluded to in Genesis chapter 22. Because Abraham was deemed righteous for believing in God's promises. However, in chapter 22, God called upon Abraham to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. And as Abraham was obeying God's command and about to sacrifice his son, God sent his angel to tell Abraham to stop. For now I know, as the angel says, for now I know that you fear me. In other words, prior to this, God did not know whether or not Abraham feared him. This contradicts this Greek idea that God knows everything, this Greek concept of God, which isn't the Bible. We have free will, contrary to what the heretical Calvinists believe, and God does not know necessarily all that we will choose. God does not know everything. He knows all possibilities, but we have free will, and if he knew every single thing that we were going to do, we would not have free will. And that is why we are created in the image of God. We have free will. But what I am saying is that most Christians' theology is incorrect, is what I'm saying. And one needs to demonstrate their faith. One needs to actualize their faith. Faith meaning trust in God, which is what the story of the sacrifice of Isaac is about. Anyway, so that's the point of the mark of the Antichrist, to demonstrate your faith. Are you going to sacrifice your career, for example? Or are you too concerned about losing your job and not being able to support, and fear of not being able to support your family or whatever, even less than that, not losing the position you have at the particular, whatever, you know what I'm saying? Or not being able to go on a vacation. From what I have heard, there are Christians, quote unquote Christians, that have taken the mark of the Antichrist, so that they could travel. And go on a vacation. So, in other words, they failed. Because they should have known that it is a spiritual abomination. And they do know. They do know. Furthermore, other Christians have been warning them, so they were ignoring them. And that's because they were unrighteous. They were ignoring the Christians that were warning them, following the propaganda about them being conspiracy theorists, etc., which is propaganda from the left and Satan, and they fell for it because spiritually they weren't really all in. They weren't loving the truth. And the inverse of the mark of the Antichrist in Ezekiel chapter 9, those that receive the mark and are spared from the judgment destruction are those that are crying out for justice and righteousness. And these people that took the mark, it was a way for God to weed out who and who wasn't crying out for truth, justice, and righteousness. And one of the most unrighteous things about it was not how it could harm you, or even, and I shouldn't say even, but one of the things that does make it a spiritual abomination is that it uses cells from pre-birthed humans, okay? But one of the biggest reasons why taking it was extremely unrighteous is because by doing so, you were enforcing the Antichrist system that is forcing others, or rather compelling others, to take it. So in other words, when you participate in it by doing it, you are enabling the system that compels other quote-unquote Christians to take it, and other people, for that matter. This thing that is highly dangerous, for example. So, and so, that's also why it is unrighteous, because it's about others, not you, not the individual, right? So, anyway, In other words, many people took it knowing that it was unrighteous, but they thought they would do it because they need to go traveling or whatever. But what about others? What about the person that was threatened with their job loss? Someone taking it enabled the system to be able to do that to others, because if 70% of the people say no, the whole mass formation, mass psychosis, totalitarian movement ends right there. But the reason why any totalitarian movement is able to breathe, get oxygen, and keep going forward and expanding is through people's compliance and going along with it. So in a mass formation, 30% of the people are hypnotized and, brainwashed. 70% of the people are just going along for convenience, and the other 30% are trying to fight back and wake people up, trying to fight with the truth in a mass formation, mass totalitarian movement, a mass psychosis. Anyway, so if enough people say no, the whole thing falls apart. So anyway, that's the reason why it is unrighteous. So anyway, back to what I was saying, it's all a test of faith, and that's why we have all of this church symbolism here connected with the mark of the Antichrist. Okay, so therefore, this is more confirmation of the prophetic relevance of Hill's mansion fire in the attic, right? Because upper room symbolism, as I was getting at. Okay, it's really quite something that we have this mansion fire in the attic involving the Chiefs player who caught the play in Super Bowl 54. By the way, Super Bowl 54 is because of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment and how they were not paid what the other white Northern soldiers were paid. The 54th Massachusetts was the first black regiment in the Civil War, which was key in winning the Civil War. But anyway, the big story, one big part of the story is how they were not paid the equivalent amount that the other white Northern soldiers were paid. This was official policy from Washington, D.C. It was an example of oppressive minority laws. And this currency, by the way, it was $13. Whoa, wait a second. This really is all relevant here. Yeah. Okay, so anyway, so they were not paid $13. And the reason why God has incorporated signs involving the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, or that hint at the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, such as Super Bowl 54, which was all about the mark of the Antichrist, as I just explained, is because the mark of the Antichrist will soon be enforced through digital programmable currency. That's the reason for the symbolism in the $13 that the 54th Massachusetts Regiment weren't paid. The programmable digital currency will restrict people from buying and selling food, as is described in Bible prophecy. In other words, one will only be able to buy and sell food if they have taken the mark of the Antichrist. Horrific. The horrific thing that the evil left will soon do in their civil war against true conservatives and Christians, as described in Bible prophecy. Okay, and that will happen, by the way, when food is rationed after the coming solar flare on the sun that will knock out the nation's power. That's how the food shortage will happen, which will lead to the rationing of food to only those who have taken the mark. All right? But so anyway, okay, so
it's really quite something that we have this mansion fire in the attic involving the Chiefs player who caught the play in Super Bowl 54. As I mentioned, the Chiefs symbolize fire and Pentecost, which means 50th. It was their first Super Bowl appearance in literally 50 years. Their colors, yellow and red, symbolize fire. The quarterback was said to have caught fire at the end of the game. This was the news headline. Prior to the game, he auctioned off his firefighter helmet for charity. After the game, a Chiefs fan accidentally caught himself on fire. Prior to the Chiefs Super Bowl, the first woman fire chief for Kansas City and the first openly lesbian fire chief for San Francisco had a friendly bet. The two halftime performers, Shakira and J-Lo, were said to have been on fire. In other words, we had all of this fire symbolism in that Chiefs Super Bowl, and it was for the purpose of symbolizing Pentecost, tongues of fire in the upper room. This is why it is astounding that we have this Hill Mansion fire in the attic sign. Again and again, now that Hill is a Miami Dolphin, this fire on January 3rd, which hints at 13 in Dolphins, points to the fire on the sun that is coming 50 days later. And again, Hill signed with the Dolphins for $120 million, and 120 is Pentecost symbolism. Which is why the coming fire on the sun is 50 days after the Hill Mansion fire in the attic. Aerial news footage of the fire at the mansion focuses on a large hole in the roof of the mansion with smoke coming out. By the way, it was fire and smoke that came down on Mount Sinai on the first Pentecost. Anyway, this is more upper room and Pentecost fire symbolism. God uses records and extremes for his signs. Hill's contract for 120 disciples in Pentecost, million for 4 years, made him the highest paid receiver in the NFL based on an average yearly salary. The fire was started by a child playing with a lighter. The rapture will be on Pentecost. Those who will be raptured will be born again, and like Jesus said, will be like a child. The rapture sign in Revelation 12 depicts a child. Tyreek Hill's mansion is 12 miles away from the Dolphins' practice facility, which is where Hill was at the time of the fire. Part of the news story is how Hill suddenly disappeared from practice 12 miles away to return to his mansion. Quarterback Mahomes mentioned to reporters that he didn't know Hill had left practice until after he was gone. Okay? This hints at the sudden and mysterious disappearance of those who will be raptured and will then rest in their mansions. Okay, so in John 14, Jesus said that mansions are being prepared for God's faithful. For those that don't know, the rapture is Christianity's most preposterous idea, and it is that, as described in the Bible, God's faithful will disappear instantly, they won't die, and they will be taken to heaven, and then will rest in their mansions until the second coming, when they will return with Lord Jesus Christ back to earth. Okay? So, this is hinted at, because a big part of the story is how Tyreek Hill suddenly and mysteriously disappeared from the practice facility 12 miles away. 12 hints at Revelation 12, which describes the rapture. Okay? Hill was at practice 12 miles away when he suddenly disappeared to be at his mansion. Hill, Chiefs, upper room fire, $120 million contract is all Pentecost symbolism. The rapture will be on Pentecost, 12 times 12 days, after Hill suddenly left practice 12 miles away from his mansion. Those raptured will be rescued from the Antichrist, who is the basketball president who wore jersey 23. It was 20 firefighter units that required 30 minutes to put out the fire. 20 units and 30 minutes hints at the number 23. And of course, the number 144, which is 12 times 12, symbolizes those that will be raptured in Revelation chapter 7. And so it is amazing to have this mansion fire sign 144 days before the rapture, which, by the way, will be on Pentecost, in the calendar that watches for new moons, which will be May 26th, 2024. And this prediction will prove this. And this is the reason for this prediction that is from God, to prove this. The date of the rapture. Case closed. End of debate. The rapture will be on Pentecost on May 26th. God frequently repeats a number 3 times for emphasis of its symbolic meaning. Dolphins equal the number 13, as I explained. This Tyreek Hill Dolphins sign on the date 1-3, which hints at 13, is 13 plus 13 plus 13 days before Tyreek Hill and the Dolphins will play in the Super Bowl on February 11th, 2024. And that's a prediction. As I mentioned earlier, this is a prediction, and it was predicted a year ago. Well, I knew that the 49ers would win a year ago. I can't recall when I actually concluded with 100% certainty that they will be playing the Dolphins, but it was before the season began. All right. It has been known since before the season started, as I just wrote, that the Dolphins will be in this year's Super Bowl. Okay. This morning, as I was in the process of waking up, a huge download was received regarding the signs on 1-3, January 3rd. There's tons more to this. 1-3 was the date that the Epstein documents began to be unsealed. In the sports news world, there is a huge story related to this. Aaron Rodgers, famous quarterback Aaron Rodgers, made a comment on the very popular Pat McAfee podcast. By the way, I am not a sports follower. I follow sports signs because they are important in God's signs. Okay, what was I saying about that? Okay, so the comment was about how Aaron Rodgers' comment on the McAfee podcast was about how he expected Jimmy Kimmel's name to be on the list. In a now infamous tweet, Jimmy Kimmel replied with insults and threatened legal action. Kimmel's reply was the news on January 3rd. Kimmel's and Rodgers' feud began with Kimmel's jokes about Rodgers being quote-unquote anti-thing. You know what I'm talking about. The what I'm talking about, thing, etc. Jimmy Kimmel has been one of the worst of the degenerate late-night talk shows with his partisan politics, blue team, civil war, evil propaganda, and like the others, and like the other hosts, he was known for promoting the thing, right? Back in the day, as you probably are aware, these late night talk show hosts continuously, stupidly kept promoting the thing with their skits and jokes and whatever, because of course they were being paid to. Okay? If you don't know that, I mean, come on, please start thinking a little bit more. All of these networks are bought and paid for by the thing industry, right? These news networks also, 75% of their ad revenue in non-election years comes from the thing industry. That's a fact. Okay, so God has found a way to convert these hosts' promotion of the mark into a prophetic sign. He has done this through Aaron Rodgers. This Rodgers-Kimmel drama is currently the big news in the sports world. For example, ESPN officially apologized for Rodgers' comments yesterday. Likewise, the host Pat McAfee has apologized for his supposed role. This connection between and you know that what's behind that too is the thing industry. The ESPN and Pat McAfee are freaking out because everything is owned by the thing industry, right? And Rodgers' feud with Kimmel is about the thing. Originally, okay? But also, ESPN is in some way, the ownership of ESPN is related to the ownership of the network on which Jimmy Kimmel is on. Okay. This connection between Rodgers, Kimmel, and Epstein, because again, this whole thing started with Rodgers saying that he predicted that Jimmy Kimmel will be on the list that was released on January 3rd. The first installment of the Epstein list was released on January 3rd, this prophetic date. Okay? So this connection between Rodgers, Kimmel, and Epstein confirms the prophetic significance of Epstein's death exactly 70 weeks. Okay? The most central prophecy in the Bible is the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, and the 70th week regards the period of the Antichrist. Okay? So Epstein, now, and the thing day, December 11th, 2020, when the you-know-what organization approved the thing, okay, and Trump trumpeted the thing from the Oval Office, etc. Okay, in other words, I've explained this many other times in other videos, much more than I will right now, but this date is Thing Day in God's signs, okay? December 11th, huge date that connects to so many other things in God's big picture of signs, which is only being explained on this channel. But a huge connection is a 70 weeks connection to Thing Day. Because God uses 70 weeks connections for what I just explained, the 70 weeks prophecy. So what happened 70 weeks before Thing Day? Well, you would think that something important happened because it is 70 weeks before Thing Day. The thing that happened on that day, and I forget what date it is exactly, it was in July of 2019. That was the day that Jeffrey Epstein died. Okay? So why did Epstein die? So in terms of God's signs, why did Epstein die 70 weeks before Thing Day? Epstein was a CIA construct, quote unquote, as one wise man has put it. I mean, what is with the Epstein phenomenon? What is that? Who is Epstein? There's this mystery behind Epstein. And people that are wise know that the pieces don't fit. And it's quite clear what's really going on. There's all kinds of evidence, by the way. It's not just a conspiratorial mindset. And by the way, I do not have a conspiratorial mindset or personality. Period. I mean, I used to get quite angry with people that said that the
this was a long time ago. I don't get angry in general, but I used to get cross with people that would say that the Twin Towers were brought down, for example, by the government. And I think just for example, the moon landing happened, and the people that put forward all the things that claim to prove that it didn't are out to lunch, because all it takes is a simple, quick Google search and to debunk whatever they're trying to say about the Van Allen belt or whatever they're coming up with, right? So this is to give you my conspiracy theory bona fides, okay? But there is conspiracy fact. Conspiracies happen, JFK was murdered by the CIA. That's quite clear from the evidence. It's overwhelming, actually. So, anyway, the Thing rollout, the Thing was a program by the CIA, but not just the CIA, but the Department of Defense, and that's a fact. That's not even like speculation. You can. There's all kinds of reality documents that prove this. When the Thing was being distributed, it was being distributed by the military, for example. But the whole thing was a CIA Department of Defense operation. And Epstein was a stooge. He wasn't a stooge. He was a CIA construct. In other words, what was behind Epstein? He was an operation. He was a CIA operation, is what it was, and supported by the CIA, right? But anyway, Epstein was involved with things and the thing industry, big time. That's why, for example, his path crossed with, you know who I'm talking about, the founder of Microsoft. I'm not going to say his name. So you get the idea, okay? So anyway, let's move on here. But this is the reason for all of this connection between the Rogers, Kimmel, Epstein in God's Signs. Because the Rogers-Kimmel feud began over the Thing. That's the symbolic connection here. And it all connects to Epstein, who was deeply involved in the Thing industry. Right? For example, blackmailing through sex scandal. That's what he was up to, by the way. People in the Thing industry from MIT and, for example. All right. So Aaron Rodgers, and when the prediction comes to pass, by the way, it will prove everything that I have just said. And this is the reason why God has given me a voice through this prediction. Aaron Rodgers was player number 12 for the Packers for his long career with the Packers. As explained in September 2023, the big sign on 9/11/2023 was Rodgers' season-ending injury in the first drive of his first game for the New York Jets. This pointed back to Brady, number 12, Tom Brady, the GOAT, greatest of all time of football, and his first game after the season-ending injury to Drew Bledsoe. Player 12, Tom Brady, replaced player 11, Drew Bledsoe, 12 days after 9/11. After the linebacker New York Jet crashed into Bledsoe. So Tom Brady replaced Bledsoe 12 days after 9/11, and he replaced Bledsoe after the New York Jet linebacker crashed into Bledsoe, causing internal bleeding, hence bled so that almost killed him, which hinted at the Jets that crashed, because it was a linebacker New York Jet that crashed into the football quarterback. And this hinted at the Jets that crashed into the towers in New York that looked like a giant 11, hence why Bledsoe was player number 11. This is all explained much more in the amazing Rodgers video. So I made a whole video about this and much more. So watch the Rodgers video, Aaron Rodgers, okay, that I made back in September. It was first made in September. I've edited it since then, so the post date won't be in September anymore. Anyway, the point here is that number 12, Aaron Rodgers, is important regarding Rodgers, the Rodgers 9/11/2023 sign, and Brady number 12 connection also pointed to the number 12 Joe Namath, as I explained in the Rodgers video. So it's all about number 12 here, in other words, okay? In other words, what I'm saying is that the Rodgers sign on 9/11/2023 pointed back to Brady number 12, and which in turn pointed to Joe Namath number 12. And okay, so this Rodgers number 12 sign on January 3rd was the same day that the other football story about Hill's return to his mansion from his practice facility 12 miles away. And that was the news story about how he returned from his practice that was 12 miles away. This gives us our 12 times 12 that confirms the 12 times 12 days from January 3rd to the rapture on May 26th, 2024. Why will God's faithful be raptured? To escape persecution involving the thing. Which is why these signs incorporate Epstein and the feud between Kimmel and Rodgers that began with criticism over Rodgers' decision regarding the thing. The feud being part of the bigger civil war, or in fact, symbolism for the bigger civil war that is leading to genocide by the blue team on true conservatives and Christians. In the unsealed Epstein documents, it has also come out that Michael Jackson is on the list. Jackson died from taking a thing, right? MJ equals 23 in simple English gematria, which if you don't know what gematria is, 1 equals, I mentioned this earlier, I'm sure, right? And Jackson grew up on 2300 Jackson Street in Chicago. It was actually Gary, Indiana, a suburb of Chicago. And Chicago is symbolism for Obama, who was the basketball president who wore 23, which is why Michael Jordan wore 23, who played for Chicago, and his initials are MJ, which equal 23, and why Michael Jackson's initials equal 23, and why he grew up in Chicago at 2300 Jackson Street, and why he died from a thing, because the thing is the mark of the Antichrist, and Obama is the Antichrist who will enforce the thing. The Epstein documents began to be unsealed. Oh, and by the way, Michael Jackson died at the age of 50, come to think of it. And his name is on the Epstein list, which began to be released 50 days before the sun explosion. Okay. The Epstein documents began to be unsealed on the day that the bomb exploded 2,300 feet from Soleimani's grave. This Rodgers sign on January 3rd is 31 days, a reflection of 1-3, to the predicted explosions in New York on 2-3, February 3rd, which hints at 23.
Rodgers is famous for joining the New York Jets this season and then getting injured in his first drive in the first game of the season. The first drive of the first game hints at 1-1, and therefore the number 11. 31 is the 11th prime number. It was Flight 11, New York Jets symbolism, that struck the Twin Towers that looked like a giant 11 in New York, in the 11th state. I am pleased we finally have a solid confirmation for the prophetic significance of Epstein's death exactly 70 weeks before Thing Day, which therefore confirms, for those that are aware, that the Thing is a CIA operation. When the prediction comes to pass, it will prove what I am saying. And this is the purpose of this prediction that is from God. God is saying through his signs that the Thing is a CIA operation. I already gave you my anti-conspiracy theory credentials. This is a conspiracy fact. Since 2016, especially, with Brexit and the election of Trump, the U.S. intelligence services and other countries as well have been, refocused, turned their focus from their purview of destabilizing enemy governments and conducting intelligence operations, propaganda, and manipulation of public opinion in other countries, etc. They have turned that on America. They've turned it on their own country. They've been doing what they perfected for decades, psychological warfare, fifth generation warfare. They've turned fifth generation warfare onto its own public. And they have their operatives all throughout the media. That has been known for decades. If you don't know that, you don't know about much about history, because a big thing in the 1970s was the Church Committee. And this all came out back in the 1970s. And they were scolded by Congress to stop doing this, to stop infiltrating American media with their operatives. Well, we're in the middle of a civil war, literally, and one side, well, both sides believe that the other side is evil and must be stopped, but the blue team believes that it must be stopped at all costs, including anti-democratic costs. In the name of ironically, in the name of saving democracy, they need to destroy it. That's essentially what's happening. And that's why it all is leading to the dictator Antichrist, Barack Obama, the leader of the blue team. Well, anyway, the blue team and the deep state have turned their... Anyway, the blue team and the you-know-what state, the state that is down deeply into, I'll say deeply, you know what I'm talking about now, okay? Put the two words together. They've turned they've turned their focus on they're
on doing what they always have done and have perfected on their own country, as I just explained. And this is the reason why in God's signs, Epstein died exactly 70 weeks before Thing Day. Because the thing is an operation. It was timed prior to the referendum. You know what I'm talking about, right? The excuse me. Before the 2020 referendum, which was shoplifted, but it was timed for that so that they could manipulate that through the with the CVD. They could manipulate the results of and shoplift the referendum through the shoplifting, through the ballet. Well, change a vowel there. And the thing people put into a machine or enter their opinion into the machine on referendum day, right? That was all able to be manipulated through the absent ballets. Right? That was all planned, and so was the thing. The thing was also planned. The solution to all of this. That's been in the works for a long time too. Okay, so let's move on. But this is very, very important here. And God has gone through a great deal of orchestration to be able to communicate this truth to you through the death of Paul Simon. Okay, so I forgot to add that the reason why Tyreek Hill's mansion fire sign is relevant in connection with the Rogers, Kimmel, Epstein thing theme is that Hill caught the mark of the Antichrist pass in Super Bowl 54. I explained this earlier. The play of the game named Stinger, which was for 44 yards, from the 22-yard line to the 22-yard line and on 2-2 in 2020 in the coach's 222nd win. Okay, so Hill, but the point here is I want to make clear is that Hill is relevant to on January 3rd, to the Rogers sign here too, with Kimmel and Epstein and the thing on January 3rd. Because Hill caught the thing pass. The big symbolic mark of the Antichrist pass. And the mark of the Antichrist is the thing. So that's very important to make clear. On 1-3, which hints at 13, Tyreek Hill's mansion caught on fire. Hill plays for the Dolphins. Dolphins equal 13. God pointed to 1-3 through Paul Simon, and one of the ways was through the sale of Paul Simon's mansion, as explained in the video, for which the original asking price was $13 million. The story of the sale of the mansion was Simon's loss after not being able to sell for $13 million. It sold for $11.9 million, which hints at 9/11 and the warning of judgment for America. Tyreek Hill joined the Dolphins on 120, symbolism for Pentecost and upper room, $1 million. Paul Simon, in simple English gematria, is 120. That is astounding. That confirms everything. The name Paul Simon in simple English gematria is 120, and God was pointing to January 3rd ahead of time with the Paul Simon connections, as I explained in the first part of this video. And on January 3rd, we had the Tyreek Hill sign and Dolphins sign, I should say, and Tyreek Hill signed for $120 million. By the way, earlier in this video, I just realized, let me just finish this first. This is confirmation of this connection between Hill's Mansion fire and Paul Simon. Paul Simon, which equals bridge over troubled water, equals rapture, which will be on Pentecost, 144 days after the mansion fire. Those raptured will be in their mansions that have been prepared. John 14. What I was going to say is that it's just a small thing. I mistakenly said that it was quarterback Mahomes that was wondering where Tyreek Hill had gone, didn't know that he had left the practice until he had already left. It wasn't Mahomes. It was the quarterback for the Dolphins. I made a mistake there. Again, Bridge Over Troubled Water was a song, one Song of the Year at the 13th Grammys, which was how the date 1-3 was first looked at a year ago. That's how I first started to look at the date 1-3, by the way, is because I was looking at these Paul Simon connections, and the song Bridge Over Troubled Water won Song of the Year at the 13th Grammys. At least I'm pretty sure that's how I first started to look at the date 1-3. But anyway, I believe Simon's death will be on the 13th of the month, the 13th day of the year, 40 days before the sun event. And that's relevant because Bridge Over Troubled Water connects to the Hoover Dam, as I mentioned, which is flood symbolism, as is the coming solar event, because as Peter said, the coming judgment will be by fire and not water, but the first one was by water, the flood, and 40 days is a number of days in the flood account. The flood waters increased for 40 days. And so if Paul Simon is symbolizing all of this, including the Hoover Dam, for example, and flood symbolism, it is relevant that he will die 40 days before the sun event. I believe the connections confirm this. The lead, the initial thing that led me to this, was Hill's jersey number 10. January 13th, the date it is predicted that Paul Simon will die, is 10 days after January 3rd, the date that it was predicted that Paul Simon would die. And if we think about it, why is Hill's jersey number 10? There has to be a reason. You would think there would be anyway. It's for adding 10 days to the Hill Fire Mansion sign. Because of Paul Simon and his mansion, etc., all the connections that I've explained for January 3rd and Paul Simon, and how they blend in with, or match the Hill sign. So Hill's jersey number is number 10. And if we add 10 days to January 3rd, we get January 13th, the 13th day of the month, 13th day of the year. Paul Simon song Bridge Over Troubled Water won Song of the Year at the 13th Grammys. Okay, so there you have it. Now I'm just going to explain the connections to January 13th. I should say the profound, amazing connections to January 13th. All right, as we can see here, this email is composed on January 7th, okay? Which should be the date that this video is posted. And the social media platform that you are watching should say this, except for the Rumble platform does not give dates, unfortunately. So, prediction. Paul Simon will die on January 13th, 2024. This email is documenting the prediction that singer-songwriter Paul Simon will die on January 13th, 2024. Paul Simon is Jewish. The name Paul Simon in Hebrew gematria is equal to 500. January 13th, 2024 will be exactly 500% of a year after Simon's prophetic dream telling him to produce his new album, Seven Psalms. Seven Psalms was released exactly 500 months after 500,000 fans gathered in Central Park in New York for the reunion of Simon and Garfunkel concert. Seven Psalms was released on May 19th, 2023, 239 days before January 13th, 2024. 239 is the 52nd prime number. 52 equals 2 times 26, which hints at the 226th word in Strong's Concordance. And this word means prophetic sign. And so the release, in other words, the release of Seven Psalms is a prophetic sign that, among other things, is pointing to Simon's death on January 13th. All right, if you recall earlier in the video, all of the 50 symbolism with Paul Simon. Again, one of the signs was the 50th anniversary of Bridge Over Troubled Water, 50 ways to leave your lover, 50 days before the sun event, and on and on. So, in January 3rd was 229 days after the release of Seven Psalms, and 229 is the 50th prime number. Okay. So you have all of that, right? What I am saying, though, is that Paul Simon is predicted to die 500% of a year exactly after Simon's prophetic dream. Remember I said earlier in the video, too, whenever Paul Simon talks about his new album, he mentions the date of the dream, January 15th, 2019. But God designed the date of the dream in order to reveal the date that Paul Simon will die. Because the name Paul Simon in Hebrew Gematria is equal to 500. This is amazing. Also, by the way, the 500th word in Strong's Greek Concordance is the word Antichrist. But, okay, so you got it. The release of his album is a prophetic sign, as was the dream. It was a prophecy. It was a prophetic dream that he had. The sale of Paul Simon's mansion in New Canaan, Connecticut, was a prophetic sign. It was sold on August 4th, 2022, the birthday of the president who was president from 2009 until 2017. Okay, and again, if you recall, it was sold to the actor from the movie Chicago, and Obama is from Chicago. 8/4/2022, the day of Simon's sale of his mansion, is 17 months and 9 days before January 13th. And again, the sale of his mansion was on the date of the birthday of the president, who was president from 2009 until 2017. Hence the 17 months and 9 days connection. This connection is also 144% of a year. We've already established how the number 144 is the number that symbolizes those that will be raptured, rescued from the persecution of the Antichrist, Obama, and how January 3rd was 144 days before the rapture, etc. But now we have another 144 connection. Simon's song, Bridge Over Troubled Water, symbolizes this rapture rescue event, which is the reason for these 144 numbers appearing in these signs and connections. In the account of the flood, in the book of Genesis, the flood waters increased for 40 days.
In other words, a period of 40 days symbolizes God's judgment destruction on the inhabitants of the world. January 13th will be 40 days before the predicted solar flare from the sun that will knock out America's power grid on February 22nd, 2024. This coming event will be the beginning of the removal of America's divine protection and security. Simon's predicted death on January 13th will be exactly 987 months after his birth on October 13th, 1941. As explained in the video, October 13th, 1941 connects to the quote-unquote quite perfect crucifix that was observed by astronomers on the surface of the sun, which in turn connects to the ceremonial dedication of the Hoover Dam, which was also the bridge for U.S. Highway 93, symbolism for the sun that is 93 million miles from Earth, symbolism for the flood, and symbolism for bridge over troubled water, and electric power generation, the Hoover Dam. The reason for the exact 987 months between Simon's birth and death is that H987 is the word in Strong's Concordance meaning security, safety, which is why Simon's death will be 40 days before the removal of America's security on February 22, 2024. Through Simon's songs Graceland and Bridge Over Troubled Water, Simon is also symbolism for the safety and security that God's faithful have in him, and symbolism for the rapture, rescue, event that is described in Bible prophecy. This is merely scratching the surface of the reasons for how this prediction is known in advance. For more information, please visit bitchute.com or odyssey.com video channel titled Harris Crash Prediction. And also make sure that you read the website trumpprediction.com. I just want to add one thing here. This safety and security is in Christ. Many people will say they believe in God, but it isn't the same God. And that's very important. This is the righteous Christian God of the Bible we are talking about here. Those who are in Christ are safe and secure from destruction. The wages of sin is death. Ultimately, it's not even just about losing power, it's about dying. Satan's power over people is death. And Satan has people in his captivity. They are his slaves. They are his to do with and kill because of sin. But it is through Christ's death and resurrection that death has now been defeated. God defeated death, but it was necessary that he became a man to do so. And through Christ's death and resurrection, through Christ's death, Christ paid the ransom owed to Satan, the ruler of this world. And now we are free, if we choose, to follow Christ and be safe and secure in him from the destruction and death. Aliens and UFOs are demons masquerading as aliens and UFOs. Most people's spiritual experiences are demonic deception, especially if they are not a true follower of Christ. God became a man and died a horrible death at the hand of the ruler of this world, Satan, and then defeated death for you, so that you too can overcome death, which is the price that must be paid for sin. It is time to repent, which means to change one's ways and turn to God and become a disciple of Jesus. Please leave a like and upvote the video, and once this prediction has come to pass, share this video with everyone you know, and more, don't stop sharing it everywhere in social media. It is essential that everyone immediately read the homepage of my website, TrumpPrediction.com. If you are watching this on the YouTube platform, please note that not all of the videos are on YouTube. You need to switch to the BitChute.com or the Odyssey.com channel. And do it now in case you aren't able to later.